Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, breaking news. Spirit Airlines is going out of business and all flights are canceled after an attempt at a government bailout falls apart.
Hearing that Spirit is shutting down, I think it's insane.
What it means for travelers, employees, and the airline industry. Plus,
Iran offers a response to a draft peace proposal.
I am not happy.
After meeting with CENTCOM, will the president escalate to push for a better deal?
and gas prices up more than 35 cents from this time last week, as some of the world's largest oil producers get ready to meet tomorrow.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg Global Headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, May the 2nd. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all of Bloomberg's platforms on radio, TV, streaming, on Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app. And the big news story this morning, Christina, certainly is just the end of Spirit Airlines. I personally have never flown on it, but this has been a long, fraught saga here. 2 Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings, and now we see the company shutting down this morning. About 3 a.m., I think, is when they announced it.
Right, and this potential offer from the White House for a bailout that just seemed to not go anywhere. And then in the middle of the night, we've got a fun update for you. Fun is an interesting term, but our executive producer purchased a ticket to kind of track and see what they were communicating live to people who were scheduled to fly out today. And I can say that if I had a real ticket and was expecting to fly, I would not be thrilled with
the headline from that is, "Don't show up at the airport." I think that was the notice that she got.
It's not going to happen.
We'll dig into all of this in just a moment, but first let's get the headlines, including what's happening with Spirit, from Lisa Mateo. Lisa.
Yeah, let's get right to it. So a lot of travelers say they're going to miss those affordable flights, especially when the price of everything from groceries to gas seems to be going up. This Spirit traveler was heading to Houston before the shutdown.
Usually we fly Spirit all the time. Usually it's the best affordable flight, and it's kind of like that reliable car that you have. It's always get you from point A to point B safely.
So yes, all Spirit flights have been canceled. Passengers have been advised not to go to the airport. That's after the discount carrier had suffered under rising jet fuel prices, also failed to secure that deal with the Trump administration for funding. Now, in a statement, Spirit CEO Dave Davis said, quote, sustaining the business required hundreds of millions of additional dollars of liquidity that Spirit simply does not have. Now, several carriers, they have agreed to cap prices or reduce fares for customers affected by the shutdown to the war in Iran, now we go, where President Donald Trump said he's not happy with negotiations. Now, during a West Palm Beach dinner event last night, he said enough is enough.
For 47 years, Iran has been pushing everybody around. They're the bully of the Middle East. They've been scaring everybody, Israel and Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, all of them. They're all, he was the bully of the Middle East.
The president stopped short of threatening to end the ceasefire between the countries and order fresh airstrikes. Energy prices have soared because of the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Iran insists the U.S. must end a naval blockade of its ports before Tehran's leaders are willing to reopen the waterway. Oil prices did ease on Friday after touching wartime highs this week. Now, meanwhile, the Pentagon has ordered the withdrawal of about 5,000 troops from Germany. It comes days after German Chancellor Friedrich Merz questioned President Trump's handling of the war in Iran, saying the administration was, quote, being humiliated. Now, the drawdown is going to take place over the next 6 to 12 months. In other news, President Trump also said he's raising tariffs on cars and trucks from the European Union.
We have a trade deal that Scott and me and Howard and all our great people, Jameson, we all did a great trade deal, but the European Union has not adhered to it. So we've increased the tariffs on all cars coming into the United States by 25%.
Yeah, 25%. The president speaking during a rally in Florida on Friday. Christina and David, he also said those levies are not going to apply to automobiles that are built at U.S. facilities.
Lisa, thank you very much. This on the heels of some relaxation of tariffs on whiskey after the King's visit to the U.S.
And thank goodness.
And thank goodness.
Sometimes that's just what you need after a long weekend like we had last weekend. All right. Thank you, Lisa. All right. Now we're going to turn to some dispiriting news. See
oh, my gosh.
It's early. Come on,
you
give
were
me
ready,
that one.
You were getting ready for that.
I wasn't, but
For the
all right,
morning.
Spirit Airlines is shutting down and grounding their flights after a final attempt at a $500 million government bailout collapsed overnight.
Travelers are scrambling in the wake of those cancellations, stranded as the airline advises passengers not to go to the airport. Joining us now is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst George Ferguson and Bloomberg News White House Correspondent Jeff Mason. George, let me turn to you first and just get a sense of how we got to this point. I mentioned at the top of the show, this is a company that filed for Chapter 11 twice, I think, over the course of the last year. What were they trying to engineer here, and how much was a countervailing force what's been happening in the Middle East and the knock-on effect of fuel prices going up as much as they have?
Yeah, really, Spirit had been having problems for a while. Frontier had approached them and looked to purchase Spirit, and that deal came apart as JetBlue stepped in the way to take the airline. JetBlue won that competition, and after that came apart due to antitrust issues, Spirit really appeared to be, a bit listless, and the business started to deteriorate. The U.S. industry really looks to us like it has too much capacity. So fares were a challenge. You don't bring enough revenue in, obviously, you can't make profit. And this was all happening really before fuel prices spiked due to the war. And when fuel prices spiked due to the war, especially here in winter season, which is low demand season, we really didn't think Spirit had long to live, and that's ultimately what happened. I think that it's probably a good reason, or the best reason why I don't know that a bailout was really appropriate here, because again, it looked like the market already had too much capacity before the war, and Spirit was already having problems before fuel spiked.
We're going to get into the politics of that bailout conversation in just a moment, George, but let me ask you a little bit more about that potential merger between JetBlue and Spirit. So that was struck down by a judge. I think there's a lot of criticism, particularly on the right, of that happening. Walk us through the rationale for that. Why didn't that deal come to fruition? Why wasn't it consummated?
Yeah, it was on competitive issues. And really, we saw both carriers as being too small to affect the whole market. There probably needs to be some consolidation, or could have been some consolidation in the U.S. airline market. Again, I think we're seeing it now. Fares have been under pressure a bit. With the spike in fuel, it's going to be even more challenging. I think even more capacity has to come out of the marketplace. But it was struck down for anti-competitive reasons, which we really couldn't understand. Neither one of them seemed to be large enough to really affect the U.S. domestic business.
Jeff Mason, known to us as White House correspondent, you were telling me as you were sitting down, you used to cover airlines.
Former airlines correspondent.
Didn't know that.
Things I'm learning about Jeff this morning.
First job.
In that vein, we do have sound from the president just last night talking about this in Florida.
It's one of those things. We'll do it or we won't. We'll have something for you today or tomorrow. We helped out Intel, and we ended up making $40 billion. So we're looking at Spirit different kind of a thing. But we're looking at Spirit. If we can help them, we will. But we have to come first. We're first. It's America first.
So why did the president want to get involved here, and what made it fall apart?
A couple of different things. I mean, number one, the president likes good deals, as you heard him just say, and that sounds like that's one of the primary reasons why it fell apart. Number two, just sort of interestingly, Spirit Airlines has a lot of business in Florida, not too far from where he has his estate in Mar-a-Lago and West Palm Beach. That may have played a role. I don't have reporting to support that, but that just seems like a logical conclusion. Number three, you saw with Intel that the president likes to intervene in companies that are failing. That deal did turn out really well.
Yeah.
The United States coffers have brought in a bunch of money from that. So that seems to have had an influence, or at least set an example for him as well.
I'm also wondering if his interest had anything to do with the affordability crisis and the fact that as we roll into these midterms and everything is just more expensive, taking away really the cheapest option to go on vacation at a time when there is no cheap option to go on vacation is just something the president thought might be a good idea to preserve.
The irony of that, though, is that his war against Iran with Israel is what's basically put Spirit over the edge. The high fuel prices taking away what is a tight margin, especially for a low-cost airline in terms of profitability.
I do want to go through our executive producer, Carolyn Kremen, bought a ticket overnight. She booked the ticket at 5:30 p.m. At 6:38 p.m., she got an email asking if she wanted to upgrade. At 12:38 a.m., she got a notice saying the flight had been disrupted with an option to refund or rebook. At 5:45 a.m. this morning, while we were already in the office, it finally came through. We regret to inform you that all Spirit flights have been canceled, effective immediately. George, I want to ask you, I mean, Spirit has said it will refund, but it's not going to cover hotels, or if you were stuck in a layover and you got to rebook yourself, you're kind of on your own. What happens? Is there any liability or a chance to recover damages for these stranded passengers?
I think you'll be lucky to get your refund in any kind of short order. And yes, I think everything else you're never going to see any reimbursement for the inconvenience that occurred to you. It is probably good to note that we looked last night at what Spirit had on the schedule for 2Q and 3Q, which is usually about as far out as airline schedule. They're less than 2% of the U.S. and Caribbean marketplace. So it's not going to be, it's a big effect that happened to you, not going to be a huge effect in the market.
I'm going to assume Carolyn didn't use her debit card, so maybe the credit card company will step in here. But George, let me ask you a bit about how other carriers are going to react. In light of this, we heard from Sean Duffy, the transportation secretary, some encouragement that other carriers are going to maybe reduce their fares for these passengers who are stranded. What customarily happens in a moment like this, bearing in mind we haven't seen an airline fail here in many years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other carriers are going to operate in their financial best interest, right? And so I think they'll want to pick up customers. They'd like to pick up a loyal customer. That's not typically what you get out of these low-cost carriers like Frontier and Spirit, right? This is not those those well-heeled folks that are filling the loyalty program at Delta. So they may provide small incentives to try to bring them over. But my guess is they're going to act largely in their financial interest. It's a very challenging market right now, right? Fares have moved, fuel has moved twice, it's doubled, and the airlines have to recoup that in order to stay profitable. None of them will be as profitable in 2Q, if you believe their guidance, as they were in the last 2Q. So they're really scraping to try to find ways to boost fares, boost revenues. And I think they'll use the opportunity to increase fares.
Looking at this sector, looking at these ultra low-cost carriers, there was this meeting in Washington, I think about a week and a half ago, with the transportation secretary. So you had the CEOs of Allegiant and Frontier and Sun Country going to Washington to make their case. What does that say to you about the health of this sector broadly? Yes, Spirit's a unique case. It was dealing with issues for a much longer time, as we've been discussing here, George. But some of the pressures that were brought to bear on Spirit are shared by a lot of these other carriers.
Yeah, it's a very challenged business in the US. And so first, ultra low cost is, I sort of equate it to like a Ryanair type airline in Europe. Doesn't seem to have taken off as well in the US. And lately, the dynamic in the market is very challenging, right? Because if you look at the big full service carriers, you look at United and Delta especially, the way they're running their business right now is they have these big premium programs where they give their loyal customers, they have a credit card, they buy their dinners and they buy their groceries on that card, and the airline sells miles to the credit card company and generates a bunch of revenue on that. Right? Delta makes some $4 billion or so a year on that. Then they use premium, front cabin, extra leg room, all kinds of crazy things to boost revenue. And remember, in the back of all of their airplanes, I tell people, is a little Spirit Airlines or a little Frontier. They sell those fares. They can tighten those down a bit to be very competitive against Spirit and Frontier, cover the marginal cost of flying that airplane plus a little bit. If they fill the airplane 90, 100%, they get great efficiencies. They've subsidized a bit of the back of the airplane, and they're taking Spirit and Frontier sort of, they're hurting them in the marketplace. So in the US, because we don't see this dynamic in Europe and other parts of the world, they don't have the credit card fees that they can count on in other parts of the world. In the US, I think this model is getting very challenging. And so I think that we're going to have to see a slim down in those low-cost carriers in the US, I think, in order to keep them viable.
Jeff, I want to ask you about Sean Duffy and the Transportation Department under this administration versus the last administration. We saw Pete Buttigieg very aggressive with airlines, with passenger rights, with things like that. Has this administration pushed back as much with airlines? They seem to generally not like regulation. So where do we stand with all that?
I think that's true, although I think it's also not consistent with what one would normally have thought of as conservative political values to be intervening in the marketplace at all. And that's one reason why you saw Ted Cruz being pretty critical of this potential government bailout, and kind of strange bedfellows with Elizabeth Warren, who is not conservative, who is also saying, what is the What is the U.S. going to get out of this bailout? So certainly, I don't think they would want to compare themselves to the Biden administration. That said, there's been some criticism, as George was mentioning, from the right about the fact that it was the Biden administration that knocked down Spirit's proposed merger on antitrust reasons. The other thing, as long as we're talking airlines, if I can geek out a little bit about airlines and Ryanair.
We'll allow it.
I appreciate that.
Jeff.
George was talking about Ryanair, and I covered the rise of Ryanair in Europe in the early 2000s, and it is a totally different model. Europe, people jump from one country to another. The tourists, particularly in Germany, jump over to Italy, jump over here.
The UK, too, when I was there in 2005, as a really broke student, I got like a £40 ticket to Italy.
I was going to say, you probably could have gotten one for £5. Yeah. I mean, that was the model for Ryanair, and they just get butts in seats. That's what they say. Just fill those airplanes with people who are paying low fares, but increasing traffic and getting a lot of people into the plane. And that's just a different model in the U.S.
Jeff, let me ask you, pick up on something you said just a moment ago, which is the president's appetite for making deals like this one. My sense is it would have been a $500 billion investment and $500 million investment, excuse me, and then there would have been these warrants for ownership of the airline if they came through the bankruptcy. That evolved a bit over the course of the last few weeks, but we've seen it with Intel, we've seen it with other companies. This is a thing that he is proud to have pioneered and continue to do, it seems.
It's part of his political DNA to be a businessman. That's where he came from. He came from the world of business, not from the world of politics. But the airline business, which George can tell you a lot more about, is a lot tougher than Intel. And to own 90% of a low-cost airline that was already struggling would have certainly been a tough business venture for the government, and that sounds like
Trump knows the airline business, I guess, so he was in it. He's seen an airline fail as well, I should say. Trump Air was a concern for a time.
Also seen a university fail and a bunch of other ventures fail. Yeah. He's got some experience in failure in the business world as well.
All right, Jeff Mason, don't go anywhere. You're staying here. George Ferguson, you're going to join us some more in the next hour, so don't go too far. Thank you both. We'll be back with you shortly.
Just wanted to ask you, you haven't flown in Spirit, have you?
I haven't. Frontier, Jeff said he's on Frontier. Have you?
No, I haven't. But I mean, I always wondered about it, and of course, like many people, noted how much you had to pay extra, and that was maybe a barrier to doing it. But I think, George was alluding to this just a moment ago. You saw some of these major carriers having to adopt some of the policies that Spirit and these other ultra-low-cost airlines had because there was such enthusiasm for it. So like Delta, I remember ratcheting down some fares to try to draw those customers away, get them in the Sky Miles universe. But,
I mean, listen, I'm a cheap flyer when I'm by myself, but by the time you add in like luggage and actually selecting your seat, to your point, often you could get a comparable fare on something that I had status on or could get miles on.
Maybe without the layover. So.
Something like that, hopefully.
All right, we're going to come back, keep talking about this over the course of the morning. The other big story today, of course, is the Middle East. President Trump saying he is not satisfied with Iran's proposal for peace talks with the U.S. Where do things stand right now? With the war passing the critical 60-day deadline, that is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And America's biggest oil companies, they are warning that global crude markets may be nearing an inflection point of higher prices the longer the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. On an earnings call, ExxonMobil CEO Darren Wood said the market hasn't seen the full impact.
The ships got to reposition themselves. We got to work through the backlog. Then there's obviously the transit time to get the product to market. And so we're thinking there's going to be a 1 to 2 month time lag between the Strait opening up and the market seeing normal flow.
In other news, a federal appeals court has granted Louisiana's request to temporarily pause the mailing of abortion pills by mail. Now, FDA decisions had allowed the propistenone to be mailed into the state despite its abortion plan. Reproductive rights groups, they say the pill is proven to be safe. It now moves to the Supreme Court. And May Day protests, they centered on labor rights and economic justice. They were held nationwide yesterday at San Francisco International Airport. Hundreds of unionized airport workers rallied, demanding higher wages as contract negotiations drag on there. Dozens were arrested. And today, Greg Abel makes his first annual meeting as the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. Earnings are going to be released ahead of it. We're going to bring those to you live at the top of the next hour. One of Abel's biggest issues, the company's stock price. Its shares have really been beat up by the broader market since Warren Buffett announced he was retiring. David and Christina coming up at the top of the hour.
We're going to bring you those earnings. I learned this morning that Berkshire Hathaway owns Squishmallow, that company that makes the squishy
I did not know that.
objects, and there now is a Greg Abel Squishmallow. I saw it in a photograph
Seriously?
accompanying a news item. So anyway,
a little disappointed
just a
we
little
don't have that on
sidebar I
set.
wanted to offer on the heels of that report. Anyways, as Lisa said, we'll bring you those earnings as soon as they cross around the 8 o'clock hour East Coast time.
All right, President Trump says he's issuing a strong warning to the globe about dismantling Iran's nuclear capabilities, saying if the country does gain access to a nuclear weapon, it could be used on the U.S.
I'm dealing with some quite brutal people right now in the lovely country of Iran. They are very brutal, and I will tell you, we're doing very well. You cannot give Iran a nuclear weapon. It's all I can say. We can. Because they would use it on a place called Israel very quickly, and they would use it in the Middle East, and they'd use it in Europe, and I guess we'd be next, and it's not going to happen. Don't worry about it.
President Trump last night in Florida. Back with us is Bloomberg White House correspondent Jeff Mason. We're joined by Bloomberg's managing editor for the Middle East and Africa, Paul Wallace, and Bloomberg Economics defense lead, Becca Wasser. Becca, let me start with you on this issue of duration. You've written a lot in recent days about what might happen over the next few weeks, pointing out the president has this trip to China planned, and that compresses his window to do something militarily, if that's the choice that he wants to make. I'm going to read a bit from your most recent piece. President Donald Trump wants to end the Iran war, but not on the terms proposed by Tehran. That suggests the question is no longer whether he escalates to push for a better offer, but when and how. We think the most likely window for action is within the next 2 weeks, and that renewed U.S. strikes are the most likely course. Walk us through what you're thinking in light of what we've seen over the last few days, that back and forth between the U.S. and Iran, the president saying that conversations continue telephonically, to use his word. Where do things stand, and how do you see them playing out here over the next few weeks?
Listen, at the end of the day, there's a range of options that the president could choose, but the most obvious ones, and frankly, the ones that he was speaking about on the White House lawn yesterday, are really to strike a deal or renew strikes. And I think that's exactly where we are. So if the president were to greenlight some additional military action against Iran, there's a few things that cut across what that window might be. Politically, obviously, he's got a visit coming up on May 14th to China. That is a high stakes visit with President Xi. Economically, he has been very specific in saying that Iran is going to feel economic pain and that they are going to be overrun with oil within, frankly, previous few days, and that hasn't happened yet. And if you look at broader analysis, it seems to suggest that Iran has a little bit more of a runway on when they might actually, reach tank tops for some of the oil storage that it has. And then militarily, right now, there is a small window where there is 3 carrier strike groups in the region. The Ford has been on an extended deployment and is due to leave at any minute. But you need those 3 carriers because then you can have 2 in the Arabian Gulf, 1 prosecuting the strikes, 1 enforcing the blockade, and you can put another in the Red Sea to hold the Houthis at risk and make sure that those shipping lanes remain open as well. There are additional forces also en route to the Middle East, specifically Marines, and additional ground forces from the 82nd Airborne that have been long promised to be deployed. So we think that that gives this narrow window. Of course, the president could decide to strike at any time, or he could decide not to, but this provides the most logical window, the most operational window for potential strikes.
Paul Wallace, thanks for being with us this morning. We have some more sound from the president that I'm going to play you. But first, this morning, there's reporting that senior Iranian officials are telling Fars, that's a semi-official news agency in Iran, that renewed fighting between the U.S. and Iran is, quote, likely. But Trump last night in Florida saying he's not satisfied with the proposals they've gotten so far.
So they want to make a deal, but I'm not satisfied with it, so we'll see what happens. Iran wants to make a deal because they have no military left, essentially, and they want to make a deal, but I'm not satisfied with it.
Apologies, obviously that was the president on his way to Florida, not quite there yet. Where does that leave us, Paul? Is there any chance that these negotiations moving forward anytime in the near future?
It's in some ways it's hard to see us moving forward from here. We've been in a ceasefire since around April the 7th. So And in that time, there's been almost no signs that the two sides are willing and able to move towards peace talks in Pakistan or another third country like that, let alone actually reach a formal deal to end this war that began in late February. I would say we've got a double blockade at the moment of the Strait of Hormuz, and that's what's slowing us down at the moment. It's Iran effectively stopping all commercial vessels from going through the waterway, and the US blockading Iran's ports. Iran says that blockade has to be lifted and ended by the US for the two sides to go towards peace talks. Trump and the White House are saying they're not going to do that, and they seem to be satisfied that the blockade is working in terms of squeezing Iran's economy, stopping it from getting its vital oil exports out. And as Becca mentioned, the White House seems to be convinced that it's going to be only a short amount of time before Iran has reached tank tops, has filled up its storage, and will have to start shutting down wells, which again, the White House claims will be pretty devastating for those wells in the long term. But there's a lot of debate in the oil market about how long Iran actually has left. And even if it has to shut down wells, there are a lot of people are saying that it will take that option, and it would prefer that than making concessions to the US. So at the moment, it is hard to see how there's going to be a breakthrough, because we've just seen nothing really since the ceasefire started barely just under a month ago.
Yeah,
we're going to talk about those wells and how under duress they might be with Javier Blas here in just a bit, our colleague who covers energy for Bloomberg Opinion. Jeff Mason, let me have you dovetail what we've been talking about with domestic politics. So the president traveling down to Florida, giving a speech at the Villages, a retirement community in Florida, then making his way to Palm Beach on the heels of that for the event that we saw clips of there just a moment ago. I look at this latest polling from ABC, Washington Post, and Ipsos on the Iran war, and one question in particular. Considering everything, do you think the United States did the right thing in using military force against Iran, or do you think this was a mistake? 36% of respondents say right decision. 61% say it was a mistake. This is something I am sure the president is cognizant of. And how do you think, or how do you understand him to be kind of navigating, yes, the foreign policy side of this, trying to come to a deal while this is kind of biting at his heels?
It's a political albatross for him. And I think that's reflected not only in the polling that you just referenced, but also the fact that he's beginning to do some of this domestic travel that he had anticipated doing about 2 months ago. I mean, the White House was signaling to us, to reporters, that the president was going to do this long tour, domestic travel tour, to talk about politics, to talk about his economic record, to lift up some of his accomplishments over the last year and a half ahead of the midterms. And then all of that went by the wayside because of this war. The fact that he's talking about it and making his case in the Villages in Florida, I think, is at least a sign that this is something he wants to start doing and making that case. But the war is not popular, and that's a problem for him politically. I would also add, I heard Becca make her argument for why he might be considering starting strikes again. I actually think the reasoning about the China trip coming up is a reason why he wouldn't. In part because the president wants to go to China. He's canceled it once already. And that's going to be a point of tension between him and Xi Jinping. If the U.S. is in active fighting again with Iran at the same time that he goes to Beijing, that could overhang that trip in a way that he doesn't want it to.
You're supposed to go. Do you have a refundable ticket, or are you confident it's going to happen?
It's not on Spirit, is it?
Flying out on Air Force One.
Okay, all right.
All right, fancy. Well, then I'm going to ask this question of Becca. I know you want to talk about it, but I'm going to let Becca do it instead. Becca, I want to ask you about this. On Friday, the Pentagon said the U.S. is going to withdraw 5,000 troops from military bases in Germany. And then this morning, early our time, we've got a tweet from a NATO spokesperson saying, quote, "We are working with the U.S. to understand the details of their decision on force posture in Germany. This adjustment underscores the need for Europe to continue to invest more in defense and take on a greater share of the responsibility for our shared security." America has about 33,000 troops in Germany. I'm an Army brat. My brother was born on a military base in Germany. Is this operationally significant, these 5,000 troops, or is this more Trump trying to get back at the German chancellor, who has said some things the president has not liked recently?
I think it's a lot more of the latter. Listen, this was always foreseeable. There's been long discussions about reducing U.S. force presence in Germany, not only in the first Trump administration, but, essentially what this move does is it reduces U.S. force posture in Germany to what it was prior to 2002, where there was a plus up in the wake of Russia's wanton aggression of Ukraine. So I think the big thing here is not necessarily the number of forces, but it's a question about where those forces are, with some bases in Germany being more operationally important than others, but also more of a question of the message that this sends to U.S. allies and adversaries alike. Obviously, Germany has been, frankly, planning for this since 2017 when it was first brought up. This in itself is not new, but it's the matter of which it has been messaged to them as, essentially a dig after Merz's comments about President Trump, and also the way in which it's being messaged to Vladimir Putin, the very person who that increased force presence was intended to deter.
Jeff, we've got about a minute. Merz saying the U.S. is being, quote, humiliated by Iran's leadership and that they're basically outfoxing the U.S. in these negotiations.
The president just does not like to hear criticism, let alone from a fellow world leader about this war. And he's been talking about his frustration with NATO. Germany, of course, is a major NATO member, for not stepping in to help with the Strait of Hormuz. He made these comments even after that visit from King Charles, where King Charles made a pretty impassioned case in his speech to Congress for uplifting NATO and for helping to fund Ukraine. President Trump not happy with Germany, and I think that's absolutely at the root of this decision.
I feel like it's deja vu all over again. I remember when he was mad at Merkel in the first administration. It was 100%. The first time this came up.
And at that point, he threatened to take 9,500 troops out of Germany. Right. They started that, but then didn't finish it.
Yeah. Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent, he's here in New York. We're going to have him back on the show here in a few minutes. Becca Wasser, Bloomberg Economics defense lead, and Paul Wallace, Bloomberg News' managing editor for Middle East and Africa. Thanks to both of you for joining us on this Saturday.
Thanks so much. The Fed holds interest rates steady again, but will there be a change in policy under the next likely Fed chair, Kevin Warsh? That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Spirit Airlines shutting down after operations after the White House bailout fell through. Now, all flights have been canceled. Several carriers have agreed to cap prices or reduce fares for affected travelers. In a statement, CEO Dave Davis says this is tremendously disappointing and not the outcome any of us wanted. Spirit has been struggling for years, but rising jet fuel prices have put even more pressure on the company. GameStop reportedly preparing for a bid for eBay. Sources telling the Wall Street Journal the video game retailer has been building a position in eBay and may to make an offer for the business this month. Now, GameStop CEO Ryan Cohen, he's looking to scale the company beyond video games and collectibles. In the NBA playoffs, the Boston Celtics, Philadelphia 76ers, they play Game 7 tonight. The winner will play the New York Knicks in the conference semifinals. The Knicks advanced after beating the Atlanta Hawks on Thursday. I have to give the score because it was 140-89. It was ridiculous. The Timberwolves, Spurs, Lakers, Thunder have also advanced to the semifinals. Now, yesterday's NHL playoff action. The Buffalo Sabres, they won their series against the Boston Bruins, and the Vegas Golden Knights, they advanced, beating Utah Mammoth. The Flyers, the Hurricanes, they'll play game 1 of the second round tonight. Oof, I did hockey. All right, and the Kentucky Derby gets underway today at Churchill Downs, with the first of the races kicking off 11 a.m. local time. The main event's going to take place just before 7 o'clock tonight. A horse named Renegade, actually, the best odds going into the race. David and Christina.
You're a big Knicks fan.
I am a huge Knicks fan.
You must have been as surprised as I was by that score. I walked in the room and I was gobsmacked.
I watched until 9 o'clock at night. I was like, if I wake up and they lost,
quarter, there was like a 50-point margin, I thought.
It was ridiculous.
Also, you did hockey.
I did hockey. Thank you.
And horse racing. This is the full trifecta.
It's covering everything. Lisa Mateo.
She's
on it. She's on it.
All right, Kevin Warsh moving closer this week to becoming the next chair of the Federal Reserve, with the Senate Banking Committee advancing his nomination along party lines.
That's right. A full confirmation vote is expected about mid-May, just days before Jerome Powell's term as chair ends. Joining us now from Washington, we've got Kate Davidson. She's Bloomberg's managing editor of U.S. economic policy. She also oversees our Fed coverage. And Jeff Mason, who insisted on staying at the table.
It's a politics story, too.
Because everything is a politics story right now, especially this one. But Kate, we want to talk to you first, because we've got all 13 Republican senators on the Banking Committee, including Tom Tillis, voted to advance Warsh. Every Democrat voted against it. Is this division something that we think we're going to see when this goes to a full vote of the Senate?
I think it's pretty likely, in normal times, and certainly in the past, votes for Fed chairman had been, relatively bipartisan. We'd seen maybe since the financial crisis, these votes getting more, dispersed among party lines and less consensus for the Fed chair. So certainly it's a trend that we've been seeing. But I think that in the current political environment, when the president has been so open and putting so much political pressure on the Fed, it seems like it's going to be tough for Democrats to support his nominee. So I think that we'll see something quite similar. He might pick up a few Democratic votes. We haven't heard any Democrats come out explicitly endorsing him. And of course, the Justice Department dropping this probe, this criminal investigation into the Fed might change some minds. But I think it's going to be pretty partisan, perhaps the most partisan vote for a Fed chair that we've ever seen.
Okay, let's recap what we learned at the meeting and at the press conference afterward this week. There was consensus going into it. The Fed wasn't going to do anything. Lo and behold, they didn't do anything. But we had these dissents, which were interesting. 4 dissents in total: Neil Kashkari, Lori Logan, Beth Hammack, Stephen Myron. The Myron dissent expected. He wanted to see a cut. The other 3 objecting to language that indicated that it would be likely or probable that in the coming months we would see the Fed cutting rates once again, which I think is an insight into the state of this economy and the Fed's confusion about where things are headed. Let me play a bit of Jay Powell as well, because I think the open question going into this is, what would Jay Powell's role be going forward? Yes, his term as chair ends in mid-May, but he can stay on as governor for longer. He's saying he is going to stay on for a time to be determined. Let's hear what he had to say about the rationale of that.
I'm literally staying because of the actions that have been taken. I had long planned to be retiring, and the things that have happened in the last 3 months have I think left me no choice but to stay until I see them through at least that long. In addition, I don't see how this will interfere.
Kate Davidson, explain the importance of this. We have a Fed chair who's exiting, saying he's going to be laying low. There's only one chair at a time, he said. But what is his rationale as you see it for him doing this, and what role is he going to play when presumably we get a Kevin Warsh as Fed chair?
Right. Well, I think the rationale is, he didn't say this explicitly, but a lot of Fed watchers have been speculating that this would make him a lot more, this Justice Department investigation, even if there were some signal that it was going away, would make him more likely to stay on. I think there's a sense among even some legal experts that he has more legal protection if he remains at the board, which certainly makes sense. But I think that as he said in the press conference, he feels concern that these political attacks on the Fed could persist, and that he would like to stick around. I mean, of course, the part that he didn't say out loud is that him staying deprives President Trump of an open seat on the board. And he will have 3 appointees. There are 3 right now: Stephen Myron, Chris Waller, and Michelle Bowman. The latter 2 were appointed during his first term as president, but they're on the board now. And if there's a 4th governor, that would be 4 out of the 7 Fed board seats. There are certain things that the Fed board could conceivably do if you had a majority of members to make changes to the institution. So we don't know what a Kevin Warsh Fed would seek to do, what Kevin Warsh as chairman might try to do. But there seems to be a part of it, is that as long as Jay Powell is sticking around, he sees that as some extra measure of protection for the Fed at a time when he's really concerned about political interference.
Jeff, Powell saying, I'm literally staying because of the actions that have been taken. And now we've also got this sound from Trump talking about Powell saying that.
No, I don't care. If he stays on, he stays on. I just wanted to make sure that Kevin became the head. It's very unusual that they stay on. I predicted he would, because, who's going to hire him? I think he's a negative force.
Doesn't care, Jeff, doesn't care.
He absolutely cares. He absolutely cares, because he's been talking about it for ages. Their main goal in the White House has been, or at least the president's main goal, has been to get rid of Jay Powell. He's threatened to fire him multiple times. And I don't think we can underscore enough how unusual it is, the amount of political pressure that this administration, this president has put on the Fed, and specifically on the Fed chair. And Powell deciding to stay is his sort of polite middle finger to the president, saying, look, if you guys hadn't done all of these things, you would have been rid of me by now. And he's staying not just to get under the skin of the president, I'm sure, but because he's genuinely dedicated and concerned about political interference in central banking.
Struggling to see the genteel Jay Powell raising a middle finger, even as you described. Kate, I'm going to put back the full screen that we had a moment ago showing those 4 dissents. And I wonder if you could use that to talk about this committee that Kevin Warsh is going to inherit. Of course, Kevin Warsh will have a lot of power in this role, presuming he's confirmed. But what is the level of dissent that we've seen here? A marked move away from the unanimity that kind of was characteristic of the Powell committee, certainly since COVID. What does that say about the work that lies ahead for him when he assumes responsibility for it, assuming that he does?
Yeah, he's certainly stepping into a very tough job if, as has been made pretty clear, the president expects him to come in and swiftly cut rates. We knew this was going to be tough after the war in Iran, when the economic situation started changing, inflation obviously going up due to this surge in energy prices. So it was going to be tough to make an economic case right out the gate for Kevin Warsh that rate cuts were needed. We saw some ups and downs in the labor market and the jobs data that we were getting, but the unemployment rate has remained pretty low. So again, it would be hard to point to the labor market cracking. What we're seeing now, though, is Fed officials internally. There seems to be a much stronger debate than maybe we appreciated before the meeting this week and before these dissents. Strong debate over the Fed's next move, as you were alluding to, David. The conversation feels like it's really shifting from, are we going to cut rates again, to when do we need to start signaling that we might have to hike rates. So that's a huge shift. And again, it just makes Kevin Warsh's job that much harder if he comes in to try to convince this committee. It doesn't seem like a committee that's going to be easily swayed. At the same time, we haven't really heard Kevin Warsh explicitly say that he thinks rates need to come down. He wasn't asked directly at his confirmation hearing. He didn't really comment on it directly. He's talked broadly about, over the long term, productivity and AI might be a case for rate cuts. But it will be very interesting to see what he says once he's confirmed publicly about this.
All right, Kate Davidson, managing editor of U.S. Economic Policy here at Bloomberg, and of course, Jeff Mason, still at the table, and you'll hear more from him later in the show.
I think this is a really open question. Kevin Warsh, who spent his career kind of studying the Fed, how much of what he has planned for it will come to pass? I think a very open question. Coming up here, the first Formula One race of the year in the U.S., the Miami Grand Prix. We'll speak with Matt Miller and Hannah Elliott as Bloomberg This Weekend continues on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini with David Gura. All right, Formula One racing returns to Miami this weekend with the 4th leg of the World Cup Championship speeding through South Florida.
You're into the puns this morning. This year, Bloomberg House is getting up close to the action, opening up in Miami for the first time. Earlier, we spoke with Bloomberg's Matt Miller and Hannah Elliott, the hosts, of course, of the Hot Pursuit podcast.
I have now watched every race so far this season twice, even though I have great problems with the formula. It's a 50-50 formula, so half gas, half battery. But because they don't put a big enough battery in the car, the electric power can't make it all the way around for one lap. So they have to constantly slow down, put on the brakes, not drive as fast as they otherwise would to harvest energy and fill up the battery again for this artificial boost that they use to push themselves past other cars. It's like Mario Kart. Like you eat a mushroom and all of a sudden you're faster. And it doesn't, to me, feel like real racing.
Okay,
Hannah, what do you say?
I'm going to draw back and set the scene a little bit bigger here. Let's draw out. We've got 3 new teams racing this season. We've got Cadillac, which is very exciting, and Audi, who is also new to the grid, and we've got Ford giving engines for Red Bull. So this is a very big deal to have these new teams involved. We do have some new rules and regulations, which arguably are making the racing more interesting because now it's really a toss-up. It's not just going to be Red Bull dominating. It's not just going to be Ferrari, obviously, dominating. Mercedes is doing really well. But in past years, we had seen years and years and years of the same people winning races. And actually this year, it's kind of interesting because there are a lot of unexpected surprises happening.
And it's not Matt, just about...
I mean, look.
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, my point was going to be, I am much older than all of us here. So I started watching Formula One in the 90s. And back then when you had Ayrton Senna, right, versus Prost, or Schumacher versus Hakkinen, it was about limit driving. The drivers are giving 10 tenths. And it was about really the pilot as much as or more than the machine. And now it's a competition about managing resources best. I mean, you have to have the best tire strategy, the best lap strategy, the best battery strategy. There's a virtual safety car. Like, there's so many different things that it takes away from that kind of man-to-man, wheel-to-wheel, nail-biting, edge-of-your-seat competition that I love.
So we had this movie, the Formula One movie with Brad Pitt. There is interest in broadening the appeal. I know whenever I travel overseas, enthusiasm for Formula One is so huge. Yes, there are the old graybeards like Matt who've been following this since the 1990s. My word. But how much growth potential is there? How much has that movie kind of reset things for not global interest in this sport, but U.S. interest?
And the Netflix series. I mean, that's how I started getting into Formula One. I'd never heard of it before. And then I got into like the driver drama in the Netflix series.
I think when you look at the kind of deals being done around F1, that deal with Apple, IBM, the deal with LVMH, which is like a $1 billion deal, these are the indicators of the kind of growth we're seeing, the kind of platform Formula One offers.
And maybe overexposure of the brand, I think, is a concern. Look, Netflix is really what set it off here in the U.S. Drive to Survive is what made this sport, again, extremely popular in America. It's always been huge overseas. Like, if you go to a race at Silverstone, there's going to be 500,000 people that go there to watch it. You know, there's going to be 90, maybe 100 million people watching it on television. So it's always been huge overseas, especially in the UK. It's very big in Asia. But here in the US, Drive to Survive set it off. The Brad Pitt movie, I think, was pretty good. He's always been into racing.
Summer blockbuster, Academy Award nominated.
I would rather watch a race, frankly, than that movie. But the Apple partnership is what I'm watching most closely, because it makes it so accessible for almost anyone to watch. And they do incredible coverage. If you look at your Apple Maps and zoom in on the Hard Rock Cafe here in Stadium here in Miami, you can see they've actually put the track, including like the start-stop line and pit lane and all of the different places to watch the race on the map. So Apple is doing an incredible job of delivering this. You don't have to watch the whole race. You can watch it encapsulated in 30 minutes.
And we should say these are all interconnected because the Apple partnership came out of the F1 movie. Apple actually created special cameras to help film some of the racing scenes for the movie. And this whole thing has emerged as sort of a growing universe that really is all tied in together. The other thing I think we should point out is a lot of the viewership and the fan growth is among young women, which is a really big deal.
I understand that you talked with Susie Wolf at the F1 Academy. I'm assuming she's related to or married to Toto Wolff, the Mercedes guy, about how they're trying to get more women behind the wheel of the sport.
Yeah, F1 Academy is a really interesting project that they've done to try to build a feeding structure, a system that can get women drivers into the channels to eventually become F1 drivers. This is, it's a whole process. There are different levels of formula racing. So F1 Academy is basically a feeder. It's like a school that really tries to bring some of these very young, teenage women drivers up to speed, no pun intended, to eventually get to the F1 level of driving. And there are actually F1 Academy races at the beginning and during some of these F1 weekends too, which is great. Susie Wolf is the perfect ambassador for that. She herself has driven 25 laps in a Formula One car. She was the first woman to do that in many decades. Yes, married to Toto. And she's a great ambassador for it and wonderful to talk to as well.
It should be said she married Toto after her racing career had already started, and she was herself a successful driver.
Hot Pursuit's the name of the podcast. Hannah Elliott, Matt Miller, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you both so much. I feel like we were largely superfluous for that interview.
That's true. I'm
a
bit jealous they're down there. They're clearly loving it. Well, it's almost 8 o'clock here in New York. And again, we're keeping an eye on two big stories this morning. Of course, the collapse of Spirit Airlines announced overnight. And at any moment, we're going to get first quarter earnings from Berkshire Hathaway. That's going to come up here in just a sec.
That's right. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 o'clock in New York from Bloomberg's global headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo, and we're bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, and analysis live this morning and every weekend from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. The breaking news at this hour: Berkshire Hathaway Q1 earnings are expected out at any minute. This ahead of Greg Abel's first annual shareholder meeting as CEO later today.
Lisa Mateo going through those numbers as they cross the Bloomberg, but I just want to set the scene. We can give viewers an indication of why this is so important. Greg Abel took over, of course, from Warren Buffett just a few months ago. This is the first quarterly earnings over which he is presiding, and it's coincident with this annual shareholder meeting that takes place in Omaha. Christina, this is of course, Woodstock for capitalists. All manner of Berkshire properties are there selling their wares. And then, of course, the marquee moment is when Greg Abel is going to take the stage. He'll be interviewed on stage and field questions from Berkshire shareholders. This is something, of course, that Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett did for many, many years. A huge deal for all those who own Berkshire stock. Greg Abel will be doing that. It'll be a different flavor this year, and I think a lot of investors wanting to see what his plans are for some $370 billion in cash that Berkshire Hathaway still has, how he plans to approach equities, and of course, what he's going to say about the sagging share price of this company.
That's right, lagging behind, and obviously the sun has set on the Oracle of Omaha's time. But yeah, all eyes on that stage. They're programming it a little bit differently this year, and we're waiting for those top lines. I understand Lisa's got some updates for us, so we're going to go there now. Lisa, what you got?
Yeah, let's get right to it. All right, so I want to start with Berkshire Hathaway first quarter operating earnings, $11.35 billion. That's an increase of 18% year over year. Then we also have first quarter operating earnings. That's 11.35%, billion. Berkshire Hathaway first quarter insurance underwriting. This is a big number that people are waiting for. Operating income of $1.72 billion. Now, if we start to look at other numbers, let's see. We did operating earnings. If we look what operating earnings were for fourth quarter, that's what we want to get to. So fourth quarter operating earnings, that was Buffett's last quarter as CEO. They fell about 30%. So now we're seeing an increase of about 18%. Insurance underwriting earnings, they slumped more than 54% last quarter. That's fourth quarter. If we take a look at fourth quarter as well, they took a $4.5 billion impairment charge for the quarter. Still waiting to see what that's going to come into as far as this quarter. But other things, we're going to start looking for operating earnings at the railroad unit. That's also going to be key to this. And also their utilities business. We're going to be taking a closer look at this as soon as these numbers continue to come in. But we'll continue to follow them, guys, because there's a lot of things to compare them to. I mean, we have the meeting that's coming up later this morning. There's a $373 billion, cash pile. So it'll be interesting to see where they go with that, because Kraft Heinz hasn't been doing that well. Occidental Petroleum hasn't been doing that well either.
No, that'll be a huge source of fascination. I should say that's not something that Greg Abel has to deal with himself. It's something that Warren Buffett fielded a lot of questions about over the course of his tenure over the last few years as well. Just a really sizable amount of cash there.
Right, he basically said there was a lack of attractive opportunities and he couldn't find a better place to park it. So that's something that Abel's going to have to deal with. And he's, signaled maybe that could be changing. Possibly they could be deploying more capital. Again, they also did stock buybacks, but we'll have somebody here to help us dig through all that as those numbers come in this morning.
We're going to do that. And of course, this is a huge, multifaceted conglomerate, but insurance so crucial to the way that Berkshire operates. That has been a problem for this company over the last few years. And I just want to note here before we get to our next story, those Class B shares have lagged the S&P 500 by more than 37 percentage points over the last 12 months. So yes, there will be questions about that cash pile, about Greg Abel's approach to equities, the company more broadly, but I think there's just a growing concern probably among many investors about how this company is doing again in this post-Oracle of Omaha era.
No coming in. The cash pile hit a record of $397.38 billion for the first quarter. So yeah,
as Christina said, we're going to come back to this in just a moment here with one of our analysts who covers the company for Bloomberg Intelligence. The other big breaking news this morning: Spirit Airlines shuttering their operations after an attempt to secure a $500 million government bailout failed. All flights canceled, thousands of jobs on the line, and customers left stranded in places across the country.
That's right. And if you are stuck somewhere, Spirit will not be compensating you for those rescheduled flights or hotel rooms. Back with us now is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airline Analyst George Ferguson. George, what do you do if you have a Spirit airline ticket booked? If you are in the middle of taking a flight, are you just pretty much on your own?
I think you are right. I think you got to go book something away from Spirit Airlines to get you to your final destination. And I think you got to I'd get into the refund queue as soon as you can.
George, we talked a little bit about this last hour. I'd love to get into it more here. The way that Spirit Airlines was created, we talked a lot about Ryanair, this European counterpart, and how that was an inspiration for this airline. What was, during the heyday, Spirit Airlines able to do that made it a success to start, made it an airline that I think a lot of people saw as more than a viable option for them as they traveled across these United States?
I really think for the airlines like Spirit and Frontier, it was all about delivering seats at the cheapest price, right? And so for investors, that was the exciting part. For consumers, it was discount fares, right? That was their biggest, most important offering.
Why do budget airlines seem to struggle here in the U.S.? I remember growing up, I was out west, and we had Westpac was a big thing for a while. You'd get like mystery tickets, $25. This seems to be a good idea, but these companies really struggle here, whereas we do see them doing better in Europe. Is it just a matter of mileage? It's a bigger country. It's harder to operate. What's the deal?
Yeah, there's just there's some distinct differences between the U.S. and Europe, other parts of the world that I think make it more difficult to do budget airlines. I think one thing important to note as well is, first, to start out, is look, we went through sort of the late 80s and 90s. I know that's ancient history for a lot of people. That's when I was a young man thinking about being an airline pilot myself. And they were rough days for pilots, right? There was lots of pilots trained by the military. Airlines would go boom and bust. Pilots would lose their job, have nothing to do for a while. So we had excess pilots in the world. Sort of as we broke into the 2000s, that changed, right? The military wasn't training as many. Young kids weren't coming up through flight schools to learn to fly. So pilots went to a bit of a shortage. And the last couple of flight contracts, they come every 5 years. We got one coming in 2027. We have Delta will kick off negotiations with the union in 2027. The last couple of contracts, pilots got 20% pay increases to start the contract, and then 4 or 5% per year. So one of the challenges with the U.S. is there's a single pilot union, ALPA, that does most of the negotiating with the airlines. And they've really tightened down pay scales. So the low-cost carriers really can't gain in the U.S. a very big advantage from lower wages. They just don't get it. The two big things in an airline, the two big costs are wages and fuel. They all fly the same airplanes. Fuel's hard to win on. And wages, again, have gotten more compressed. And so when you look at like the Ryanairs in Europe, they'll base crews in different countries, and they'll use those countries, those crews, they'll negotiate them against each other to keep wages down. They do it. They're the best in the industry doing that. And so we see that when we look at their cost per available seat mile compared to the U.S. counterparts.
George, let me interrupt you just to ask about that second pressure you mentioned, which were fuel prices. And I'm going to read a bit here from the statement that we got from the president and CEO of Spirit Airlines. He said, the sudden and sustained rise in fuel prices in recent weeks ultimately has left us with no alternative but to pursue an orderly wind down of the company. Sustaining the business required hundreds of millions of additional dollars of liquidity that Spirit simply does not have and could not procure. This is tremendously disappointing and not the outcome any of us wanted. A two-part question. How much did the war in Iran and the subsequent rise in prices lead us to this moment? And then pulling back to all of the airlines that you cover, how acute is this pressure from rising fuel prices? And what does that portend for the months ahead, for the summer travel season especially?
Yeah, it's pretty acute. So first, Spirit was having problems before the war in Iran. As we were sort of winding down the end of last year, fares were under pressure in the U.S. market, especially for basic economy. Spirit was already having problems. They had filed bankruptcy twice. We thought they weren't going to make the winter months anyways. And then the war in Iran came along, and jet fuel doubled in price. And then we kind of knew Spirit really wasn't going to make it without some help, right? We think they were probably burning $500 million a month at least, right? So it was getting very difficult. Look, the war in Iran, again, it doubled jet fuel prices. And if jet fuel is about 30% of an airline's costs, right, or more, 30 to 40, we think the airlines need, 15 to 20% fare increases across the board to get back to profitability levels they were, last year before fuel prices increased. We heard from airlines as we went through the earnings season We heard a lot of them lay out the cadence that they thought they could get those fare levels back, right? Because that's the only way to compensate for these higher fuel costs. U.S. airlines don't hedge. And so a lot of them told us they thought by the end of this year and into next, they would finally recover the full additional cost of fuel if fuel prices stayed where they are right now. So the airlines know they're not bouncing back to the profitability they had last year. And the more basic economy you are, if you're Frontier and even not so much basic economy, JetBlue, we're watching you very closely because second quarter probably looks like another rough quarter, even going into this summer flying season, which is typically pretty strong.
And we've got a headline across the terminal saying Delta is going to offer rescue fares in markets where Spirit operates. I also saw a similar statement from American this morning saying they're going to try to cap fares, maybe capture some of those Spirit travelers. I do want to ask you about the timing of this because from the outside, it seemed to happen really quickly in that folks were tweeting at Spirit last night saying, should I show up for my flight? And the response on social media, which I'm sure was, some mid-level social media person was like, yes, everything is fine, keep going, to the point where our executive producer bought a ticket last night and she documented the TikTok of what she was being told by the airline when. We did this last hour, but I'm going to go through it again. So at 5:30 p.m., she booked a flight to Dallas from LGA LaGuardia here in New York. At 6:38, she got an email asking if she'd like to upgrade. At midnight, she got a notice saying the flight had been disrupted with an option to refund or rebook. 1:04 a.m., the flight was canceled, still with an option to refund or rebook. And it wasn't until 5:45 a.m., when we were all here in the office, that she got the official, we regret to inform you that all Spirit flights have been canceled. Why so late? Were they actually trying to recover and pull out of this dive here? That wasn't a pun that I intended to make, but we got there anyway. Or was it just that this unraveled really precipitously and it really did happen at this speed?
So we've been hearing for sort of the last week or so that Spirit was getting very close to running out of cash and winding down operations. I think the confusion here was part of it was created by the government, which would come in and talked about an individual potential bailout of Spirit or even a broader bailout with some of the other low-cost carriers. And you can imagine if you're a manager at Spirit, you want to make sure that you've got people to run the operation if you're still running operations. So you never quite know what that right time to say is, hey, roll over and get a couple extra hours of sleep Saturday morning. It's not going to matter. I would note, I was glad to see they tried to upsell you and get try to get a little more premium.
Did not purchase that. Yeah.
Down to the wire, trying to get that upgrade. We didn't get approval, so we didn't buy it.
George, let me ask you lastly what happens next. Christina mentioning we have these other airlines offering these rescue fares. Look, Spirit Airlines has planes, has infrastructure. Who's looking at that now? Who stands to benefit as a result of this? And conversely, are there other ultra low-cost carriers here who are watching all of this unfold with some worry and trepidation that they might be next?
Yeah, well, I think if you're a low-cost carrier right now, like I said, the two ones that are going to watch this the closest are going to be JetBlue and Frontier, and their earnings have been under pressure. Look, Spirit had about 2% of U.S. domestic and Latin American capacity sort of in the schedules for 2Q and 3Q. So a lot of it's not coming out. We don't think this fixes the fare issue in the U.S. market, but it helps. And so, especially Fort Lauderdale, I think is an outstanding market, a lot of opportunity there. JetBlue is really big at Fort Lauderdale. So is Delta, right? And so I think that's part of Delta sweeping in and saying, let's see if we can pick up some customers here. So this is going to help the business. But again, we don't think it's going to be the final cure. And look, I think it probably gets some of those low costs into the summer. But U.S. low cost is a little bit challenged. Some of the premium fares that those full service carriers like Delta that they can garner helps to subsidize some of the back of the airplane. They fly some of those people maybe a little bit above marginal costs, so they can take some of that market share. They want that market share. The more you fill the airplane out, the more efficiencies you get. And we were talking last hour too, some of these credit card deals that are very lucrative for Delta, United, allow them an opportunity to earn money without flying people. Ultimately, they have to give them benefits to fly. there's breakage, but there's nothing better than getting cash before you have to fly somebody. That helps them subsidize some of that basic economy business too. Those loyalty programs are quite strong. So it's still going to be a challenge, I think, in the low-cost part of the world. We're putting some research out on it next week, but this does help a little bit.
George Ferguson, great to get your perspective, again, on that news that Spirit Airlines is shutting down. He mentioned that research coming out next week. Of course, you can access that on the Bloomberg terminal. George Ferguson, Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airline Analyst here at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Thanks, George. In the 2 months since the war started in Iran, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has come to a halt. Dozens of ships have come under fire, leaving thousands of crew members trapped.
One reporter took to the seas to get a first-hand look at how Iran is maintaining its blockade despite losing most of its naval forces. We spoke recently with Adrian Blomfield, senior foreign correspondent for the Telegraph, about what he saw.
When you head out to the narrowest part, you sort of hug the coast of Musandam, which is the Omani exclave next to the UAE, and then you get to the narrowest point of the strait, which is 21 nautical miles. It's quite hazy out on the waters because of the topographical nature of the strait and the Gulf. We could see some ships that were not moving sort of to the east inside the Persian Gulf proper. Down in the Gulf of Oman on the other side of the strait, we couldn't really see anything. But in the strait itself, what was most striking for us was that in the course of a couple of hours, we saw about 300, I would estimate, small speedboats bouncing across the water in the direction of the Gulf states from Iran. They had been leaving the port of Bandar Abbas, one of the most important Iranian straits, and that's just across the strait from Qumzar, which is the northernmost tip of the Omani exclave of Musandam.
That's crazy. So are all, if not most of those speedboats IRGC or Iranian origin? Is it unclear? And then you write this very lovely phrased thing that you were just talking about how the topography of that region actually makes it easier for Iran to do this, because as you were saying, the shallowness of the water, the intense heat, and the jagged cliffs hemming the strait moisture, they trap the moisture and they kind of make a cloud for them to hide these fast boats under. Where are they coming from? What are they doing?
Yes, so I think the issue when it comes to the IRGC is that this trade, the vast majority of the boats that we were seeing, is essentially a grey zone trading operation that has existed for a long time. There's always been smuggling, semi-official and official trading that goes across the strait. So going through the strait, traffic is at a halt, obviously, because there's a double blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. But there is all of this, and it's essentially petrol and diesel trading that is going on across the strait, because there's massive arbitrage opportunities, which have been a problem for Iran in the past, actually may be turning out to be a benefit. So in each of those boats, you would see diesel in drums, because it costs far less in Iran, where it's heavily subsidized, a way of trying to reduce costs for the people of Iran in order to try and prevent further discontent and kind of protests that we saw in January. You can sell that markup in the Gulf states 500 to 1,000%. So that's obviously driven this trade. So there are two aspects to this. The first is that because you've got so many boats engaged in that, it's much easier for IRGC mine-laying boats to hide in plain sight. They can just go in, from what we understand, that you don't need special equipment. You can just load a couple of mines onto a speedboat, hide them under tarpaulin, mix in with that traffic going across the strait, and then tip the mines into the sea. And it's not just that. This is also one of the ways that Iran is enforcing the blockade, because it's got scouting boats that go out among that to make sure and chart where vessels are. Obviously, there are other ways of doing that. There are more high-tech ways of doing that. But that's one of the things that's happening at the moment.
How efficacious have these boats been? You write of this mosquito fleet, borrowing a phrase that we've seen used in the Ukraine war, Ukraine using boats like these to beat off the Russians in the Black Sea. How dependent is Iran on using smaller vessels like this to lay the mines, as you've described, menace ships, keep the blockade in place on their end?
I mean, I think this is, we are seeing the naval history being rewritten at a breakneck pace Not since the introduction of the dreadnought class of ships before the First World War have we seen anything like this, and it probably is going to exceed all of that. And I've just recently been in the Black Sea with the Ukrainian Navy as well, and to see this sort of asymmetrical Navy, so the Russian Navy obviously built for conventional warfare, the US Navy the same. But both of those, the Russian Navy has been forced back. It's even been forced largely to abandon Crimea, which it obviously occupies. And similarly, the US Navy has been able to wipe out Iran's conventional Navy. But the fast boats of the IRGC's Navy, that's a different proposition. And, it is literally trying to swat millions of mosquitoes. Obviously, they're not millions. That's an analogy. But yes, within that, you can see just how difficult the operation is going to be. And at night, these boats are hiding out in coves, in caves, or just in ports in Iran. Some of them can be spotted and identified using modern techniques, using drones, using the Reapers, and to a certain extent using AI. But I think it's very difficult to find all of them. And that has been one of the challenges. And by some estimates, 5,000 to 6,000 mines have been laid in the Strait of Hormuz. And getting rid of those is going to be incredibly hard, even if the blockade is lifted.
That's crazy. I don't think I realized that it was that simple to drop a mine. I was assuming it was a slightly bigger operation. I didn't realize they were literally dumping them off the sides of these fast boats. We've also spoken several times with Arsenio Dominguez, who is at the UN Maritime Organization, just about the welfare of these sailors and captains who have been trapped out on these boats for quite a while. I know you spent some time with them. Can you talk to us about, as much as you can, what it felt like on the water, whether you felt like you were in danger while you were there, and how these seafarers are holding up?
I mean, I didn't have personal contact with any of the seafarers. I think it's very difficult to get onto those larger tankers or bulk carriers on the Gulf. I mean, I think it has been pretty difficult, all sorts of things being done to try and keep up spirits on those boats. So what I saw was with those smaller boats, and I think there's concern about in Oman about how this trade is being potentially exposed. I think it's one of the reasons why they aren't keen on journalists being out on the water. But obviously, what we felt was the incredible heat of being out there, and I think you have a sense of that suffocation, and this obvious desperation for seafarers to get home. And wondering how long they're going to be stuck there must be a pretty horrendous experience. And now it's sort of a game of chicken. And ironically, I think what I said at the sort of earlier on was that initially this smuggling process across the Strait was a problem for Iran, because Iran is subsidizing the oil, this diesel that is then being sold. So, subsidized Iranian diesel is being sold not just in the Gulf, but also in Pakistan. To a degree, that now may be a benefit to Iran, because obviously they're facing these incredible storage problems. They're desperately trying to find places to store. By some estimates from some of the people that we've been speaking to, with these small boats, you can get up to 75,000 barrels of oil a day across the Strait in small boats. That's a drop in the ocean, but every little helps. So in a way, this thing that had been a problem for Iran is now being turned into something that just helps to alleviate the pressure. And obviously, the longer Iran can withstand the pressure on its economy, the longer it believes that it can hold out and potentially come out on top in this crisis.
Adrian, let me ask you lastly, what you learned through this experience, how your sense of the integrity of this blockade, I guess on both sides, is being shaped at this moment. I think we focus a lot on all of the military might that the U.S. has marshaled. But coming away from this experience, what can you tell us that surprised you about the way that this is in place?
Well, I think, as I say, I was skeptical about what I would learn, because obviously satellite data tells us so much more in terms of how ships are moving. First of all, I mean, it's a larger stretch of water than one might imagine. I mean, even at the narrowest stretch, it's the equivalent of the Dover to Calais crossing. So there is quite a lot of space for people to try and inch their way through if you've got your AIS systems turned off. But what I think is just most striking is it is just an incredibly complicated, complex picture. One of the things that sort of people have suggested is, well, and Donald Trump has obviously threatened to do, is to blow these boats out of the water. But the chances of causing civilian damage and the civilian communities, poor rural communities living on the coast of Iran and living on the coast of Oman and even to the UAE depend on this trade for their livelihood. So you've got to take all of that into account before you consider kinetic action, full force against these kind of boats. So I think the overall lesson is that the Strait is a lot more crowded than I expected, and the challenges of dealing with this are much greater than I believed.
Adrian Blomfield of the Telegraph, and Christina, I think what stood out to me, and maybe you as well, is just how, yes, these giant ships aren't moving in the Strait, but there is so much traffic and action. And my sense before I read Adrian's piece was these small boats are menacing other ships, maybe dropping mines as we learn more about. But I didn't realize there's this very big economic transfer of oil and other fuel across the Strait still happening in these smaller boats.
This pre-existing black market that actually provides cover for the IRGC boats, because I also didn't realize it's as easy as they're really siphoning off by the barrel and throwing it on one of these fast boats and taking it back. Adrian, that was really great. Thank you so much for joining us. And we've got a lot of headlines this morning, including Berkshire Hathaway earnings. We've got airplanes, we've got Iran, and we've got Lisa Mateo to run us through all of it.
We do. Let's get to some of those top stories. President Trump says oil prices will eventually come down. Now, the president speaking during a rally in Florida yesterday.
And the only thing that I'm surprised is that I really thought oil would be, Dr. Oz, we talked about it. I thought oil would be much higher than it turned out to be. I mean, it's not low. It's certainly not low. It's going to come crashing down as soon as this war's over, and they're getting decimated.
President Trump has expressed frustration with Iranian negotiations, but he did stop short of threatening to end the ceasefire between the countries and order fresh airstrikes. Iran's foreign minister said Tehran's ready to continue diplomatic efforts if the Americans change their approach. Now, meanwhile, President Trump has sent war power letters to Congress, providing an update to the state of the U.S. forces in the region. The president also noted that he ordered a 2-week ceasefire on April 7th that has since been extended. At the same time, the Pentagon has ordered the withdrawal of about 5,000 troops from Germany. It comes days after German Chancellor Friedrich Merz questioned President Trump's handling of the war in Iran, saying the administration was being, quote, humiliated. And the drawdown will take place over the next 6 to 12 months. And yes, Berkshire Hathaway came out with first quarter earnings as Greg Abel, he gets ready for his first annual meeting as CEO. The big headline from that, its cash pile hit a record $397 billion. Another note, operating earnings, they total about $11.35 billion. That was up nearly 18% from a year earlier. Dave and Christina, I know you guys are going to be digging into this a whole lot more.
We certainly are, and that cash pile just astoundingly huge. Matt Palazzolo is in Omaha for the confab that's taking place this weekend. I suspect he's getting ready for the Berkshire picnic tonight, maybe lacing up his Brooks sneakers for the
He looks very picnic appropriate.
Invest in Yourself 5K that's taking place tomorrow. Of course, the main event, though, is the Q&A with Greg Abel that's going to take place in just a few minutes' time. Matt, thank you very much for joining us from the event itself. Just want to get your top-line reaction to these numbers. We can talk a bit about the effort that Greg Abel's going to have to go through here to inspire some confidence in Berkshire shareholders post-Buffett. But what did you make of the numbers themselves and the way that this company is doing?
Yeah, so the numbers looked good. I was looking at them as I was kind of running to get a seat, but it looked like the operating earnings came in a little bit higher than we expected, but generally pretty close.
So one of Abel's big tasks this weekend and overall is going to be to win over Buffett loyalists. How is he doing with that? What is the threshold here? And normally I would say he's going to have to do some razzle dazzle, but that's not really what made Buffett so popular. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I don't think razzle dazzle is going to be his style. He's in there for about 100 days. I think he's doing a good job so far. I saw him on the floor yesterday, walking around on the shareholder day. He was kind of greeting people. He was getting mobbed. He looked okay, kind of stepping into Buffett's shoes there. I think it's really going to come down to the operations. I think this meeting, I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more about how he's digging into the operations. And to be totally fair, the last couple of meetings with Buffett were mostly kind of stories and people asking about, the past. And this meeting, I think, will have a big view of the future. And I think that's what people really actually do want to see.
This is a company, a concern, a conglomerate that for so many years has bested the S&P 500 by a fairly large margin. Now we see the company shares fallen more than 5% year to date, lagging the S&P 500's 4% gain. How big a concern is that for Greg Abel? This is a company that does take a long-term perspective. How much agitation does that lead to among Berkshire shareholders?
Yeah, I think it's probably more of a concern for the shareholders than for Abel. I don't think Abel, or even Buffett, to be honest, worried too much about the short-term fluctuations in Berkshire's share price. I think, as you said, they're long-term investors. They're looking to compound over the long term. Berkshire's shares underperformed the S&P since Buffett announced he was leaving. But you have to understand that going into that announcement, they were at all-time highs in terms of the actual stock price and the valuation. So it wasn't a great time for Buffett to announce that he was leaving in terms of the valuation of the shares. So you've seen that big underperformance.
I'm also wondering if this dip is not necessarily reflective of the durability or viability of the company so much as it is, you're talking about kind of a natural slump after the departure of such a legendary figure. Is this essentially what sports teams would call a building year?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a completely fair statement to call this kind of a rebuilding of maybe trust or confidence for investors in management of Berkshire. I think one of the most interesting things of the Berkshire story over the past year is investors have been favoring these kind of hard asset companies, and Berkshire is the poster child for things like that. So, they've got manufacturing, they've got the railroad, they've got all these hard assets in this world of AI disruption, and it seems to be kind of a natural trade on that, but you've actually seen the shares underperform. But to your point, I think Greg Abel just needs to operate, and I think investors, they don't need to see home runs out of him for in terms of investing gains, but I think something in terms of this is how we invest in companies, these are the ones we pick, and maybe some singles or doubles versus the home runs that Buffett was accustomed to.
Matt, I'm going to recap the headlines once more here. So we see this company operating earnings of $11.35 billion, BNSF, the railroad operating income, $1.38 billion, insurance investment operations income, $2.68 billion. Of course, insurance has been something that's been a drag on this company. But then the big headline, unquestionably, is the size of this cash pile, hitting a record of $397 billion. What is going to happen with that cash pile? I think it's a question that we're asking now, but we could have asked you last year, the year before that. There has been this roiling question of when is Berkshire going to deploy that cash, and what is the answer that we hear from Greg Abel, and indeed we heard from Warren Buffett before him?
Yeah, I think the answer is unfortunately probably not a ton. I think what you will see and what we saw in this quarter is the company buying back their own shares. So Greg Abel announced this was in early March, that they had started buying back shares, and they had not done that for a while under Buffett. So I think you'll see some of that. I don't think you're going to see some sort of massive deal. I don't think Greg is looking to look externally for this first year. I think he's probably looking internally. You're also probably going to see, and I didn't get to see it before I got here, them actually selling a bunch of stocks. So one of the investment managers left the firm, and I have to dig into the numbers, but from what it was being reported was that Berkshire actually sold a bunch of the positions that he initiated. So you're probably going to see more selling and more cash generation before you see actually more cash deployment.
And do you think we see the company investing more in things that the previous had been a little reticent to do, including more tech and AI? Do you think that's an inevitable place that this company's going to have to go?
I think it's possible. I mean, you saw a position in Amazon a couple of months ago, so I don't think they're completely hesitant to get into these things. But Abel had mentioned the stocks, the core holdings, the things that they really want to be in are businesses that he completely understands. Yeah. So, I'm curious if you will see anything that's kind of out of his wheelhouse.
All right, Matt, get to your seat. Matt Palazzola there at the annual shareholder meetings of Berkshire Hathaway in Omaha. Woodstock for capitalists, this is a big deal. I've never gone. I feel quite sad about that, Christina, but
I wasn't sad, but it seems kind of fun. Now I do want to go. Maybe next year Matt will come hang out with you.
There's a lot happening. There is See's Candy and Coca-Cola available for all, and many other fun Berkshire-related things. Matt, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Matt.
On this Saturday.
All right, actor Ben McKenzie taking on a new role investigating cryptocurrency. We talked to him about his new documentary. That is next on Bloomberg This Weekend.
you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week. And I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And Spirit Airlines shutting down operations after the White House bailout fell through. Now, many travelers say they're going to miss those affordable flights.
I don't know, JetBlue and all the other companies, they're just so expensive. I feel like Spirit is just affordable, simple, nothing too fancy. It's just like home.
Well, all flights have been canceled. Several carriers have agreed to cap prices, reduce fares for affected travelers. In a statement, CEO Dave Davis said it's not the outcome any of us wanted. Spirit has been struggling for years, but those rising jet fuel prices, they put even more pressure on the company. And GameStop reportedly preparing for a bid for eBay. Sources tell the Wall Street Journal the video game retailer has been building a position in eBay and may make an offer for the business this month. GameStop, well, they're looking to expand beyond video games and those collectibles as well. David and Christina.
We were talking about Beanie Babies randomly during the break, and that made me think of eBay because they were so... It's crazy that eBay is now going to be acquired by GameStop. Anyways,
it's crazy.
Sorry, I digress. Lisa, thank you very much. World Liberty Financial, the crypto project helmed by the Trump and Witkoff families, is under fresh scrutiny this week after Bloomberg reported investors put in more than $550 million and now are locked out of the majority of their holdings, with the token trading around 54 cents.
Now, this is where actor Ben McKenzie, that's right, Ben McKenzie of the OC fame, comes in. He is the writer and director of a new film investigating cryptocurrency, and he sat down with the leaders of crypto, including Sam Bankman-Fried and others. Take a listen. How did you get here?
Great question. I have a degree in economics as an undergraduate.
Yeah.
The pandemic hit. The showbiz really wasn't functioning, especially for actors. And so I was bored out of my mind. And a buddy of mine came to me and he said, I should buy Bitcoin. It was, in the news. The celebrities were hawking it. And I love my buddy, but he's given me terrible financial advice before. He had...
As many friends do.
As many friends do. And in my 20s, he'd encouraged me to invest in some random company that had supposedly produced synthetic blood. This was in Theranos. It was some precursor scam. Anyway, I put money in. He put money in. We both lost it. He came back to me and said I should buy Bitcoin. And I'm like, Dave, I am not going to buy Bitcoin. What is it? You know? And he did that thing where he's like, it's a cryptocurrency. And I'm like, so it's money. You can buy stuff with it. Oh, yeah. And I was like, Dave, are you sure you know what you're getting into? Anyway, that led me down a rabbit hole.
Somebody with whom you talk is an historian of fraud. And he talks about sort of what goes through the mind of a fraudster, how a fraud is executed. What did you learn about kind of the way that those who are perpetrating frauds, be they financial or otherwise, are thinking about what they're doing in real time?
Yeah, I found that fascinating. This guy, Dan Davis, wrote a book called Lying for Money, which I highly recommend if you're into true crime and financial crime and how frauds work. And one of the things he told me that I thought was fascinating is that fraudsters are not like other criminals. They don't generally commit violent crimes. And they often start out as legitimate businessmen. And then sometimes they enter into the fraud through a mistake. Sometimes it's intentional. But the lie gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But they have to conceive of themselves as legitimate businessmen. They're sort of the ultimate method actors, right? Like they have to believe their own story, which I think explains perhaps why Sam Bankman-Fried was willing to talk to me on camera, even though in our Twitter profile it said, writing a book on crypto and fraud. So I couldn't understand that, but I think he still feels that he's a legitimate businessman.
You sit down with him in New York.
Yeah.
I think we have a clip of that.
I had a conversation with Alex Mashensky, Celsius. Yeah. Yep. I asked him how much real money is in crypto, and he said 10 to 15%. He said the rest is speculation.
Thank you. So as of today, I think the number of dollars in crypto have not changed massively between then and now.
One when perhaps they've lessened.
They certainly have not increased. I don't think they've decreased massively, though, which I think lines up with some of your thought that a lot of this was leverage leaving this system.
Part of the problem, if they haven't left, is that people can't get their money out. Imagine this is a regulated bank.
Oh, yeah.
This would be a big problem.
That would be a big problem.
This does not seem like the decentralized, democratized future of money that we were promised.
I think we've seen all the major carnage in the crypto industry already.
Throughout that interview, he's kind of making a claim that all of the fraud, all of the bad actors have been felled.
Yeah.
And that crypto is wide open and a clearer slate than perhaps we all expected.
Right, and then 5 months later, he's arrested. Yeah, I mean, this is a repetitive theme in crypto, is, no, okay, that was the bad guy. Oh, no, actually, that was the bad guy. Well, no, this one, at a certain point, The way I understand it is this. Look, there's the retail trading public, and those people are not bad people. They're trying to make some money. I mean, maybe some of them are, but they represent normal retail investors. And I am not doing this against them. I'm trying to protect them from an industry that I think doesn't care about them. You know what I mean? I don't see the crypto companies really doing anything to protect their customers. In fact, what they're doing is trying to change the rules, get special legislation so that they aren't treated like banks or securities or whatever. And so, yeah, I would say that like that's my motivation. I find the sort of constant deflection of like, it's just that one bad apple and that one bad, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's so much crime in crypto. A crypto company last year estimated that $154 billion of criminal activity was facilitated via cryptocurrency in 2025 alone. And that's from a crypto company, so it might be on the low end of the estimation. That is an enormous, staggering amount of criminal activity. And, and it's everything from like Russian oligarchs selling sanctioned oil to the Chinese in exchange for drones they're sending to Ukraine. It's ISIS. It's a lot of money laundering.
North Koreans are very involved in it. Trying to steal it, trying to use it, getting around sanctions.
Half the hackers, the North Korean hackers, half of the North Korean nuclear weapons program was funded via the crypto hacking teams. Right?
Why hasn't there been any kind of pushback? Because these people have gone to jail, and these scams have been revealed, and there seems to be no consequences. That's
a great question. I would say there's a couple parts. The first is, so in 2022 we were on our way. In 2023 we were on our way to like some sort of reckoning. Sam was in jail. Changpeng Zhao, Binance, pled guilty to money laundering. A bunch of other people went to jail. Alex Mashensky, who I interview in the movie, is in jail. And then Trump turned to suddenly loving cryptocurrency in the spring, summer of 2024, the election. He had called Bitcoin a scam as recently as 2021, but whether he saw there was money to be made for himself or whether he saw a constituency that he needed to woo, young men, that might have been as well, he's all of a sudden loved crypto. And then people, quite frankly, rationally did the calculation of, well, if it's a 50-50 shot of him getting reelected, and if he gets elected, he can do a lot, and has done a lot. I'll talk about that in a second. So they started betting on it, and the price went up, and it went crazy. It was at like $120,000 by the time he was in office. And now he's delivered on that. They've disbanded the DOJ crypto crime task force. The SEC has been gutted. They passed this bill called the Genius Act, which if you know this Congress, it's called the Genius Act. It's got to be stupid. And what it does is allow, amongst other things, allow corporations to issue their own money in the form of stablecoins. So literal corporate money is what we're talking about.
I want to ask you lastly just about what really seems to animate the movie you talked about just a moment ago. That is people who have done this and lost a ton of money. So Celsius, which billed itself as this kind of anti-bank, people put a ton of money into and lost all of it. And a sobering moment in the movie is you're talking to many of these folks around the country, maybe around the world, who have lost their fortunes in some cases and are having to reckon with all of that. I think about that in the context of the conversation you had with Alex Mashensky, who started that company, who I think you later described as kind of a carnival barker, and seems that way when you're at a conference kind of sitting around with him on couches like these. What is it that's so persuasive about this industry to people that maybe they let their guard down or they don't have any inhibitions about going into this nascent financial product?
Yeah. I mean, it's partially a get-rich-quick scheme, which is the oldest scheme in the books, but to be sympathetic, and I am sympathetic to the people that have lost a lot of money, I think if crypto serves any function, it's to redirect us back to the regulated system and the failures of the regulated system, to convince people or to give people a shot at actually getting ahead. I think the thing that's really pernicious about it is that, you mentioned the interviews I did with the Celsius victims. I bond with them at the beginning of the movie, and at the end of the movie I come back to them and I ask them the same question, which is, do you still believe in it, having lost all the money? And they all say yes. So amongst the hardcore group, you're really talking about, I describe in the movie as it's a projection of the hopes and dreams of all of those investors. And as long as the crypto industry will keep selling the story as long as they're buying it.
Well, that's disappointing, but highly accurate, and we're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you very much.
Ben McKenzie, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks, guys.
That was really great. We joked with him at the top of that interview. Other actors are doing skincare and things like that. And he said, well, the skincare companies wouldn't take me, so I had to investigate crypto instead. All right, get your hats and fascinators ready. The Kentucky Derby is tonight at Churchill Downs. What to know before placing your bets? That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Coming up.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini, and it is the most exciting 2 minutes in sports, the 152nd running of the Kentucky Derby tonight at Churchill Downs.
All right, last year, nearly $500 million were bet on race week. Recently, we spoke with David Papadopoulos. He is Bloomberg's managing editor and the in-house expert here on horse racing, especially when it comes to picking an unlikely winner. Here's our long shot.
In general, at the racetrack, betting on really, really long shots is a fool's errand. It's a sucker bet.
But it's so tempting because the payout is so huge.
That's exactly right. But so on most days of the year, it's a terrible bet.
Okay.
On Kentucky Derby Day, in the Derby, it's a fantastic bet, or at least it has been over the last few decades. And when I say really long shots, I'm not talking about 8-1 or 12-1. Those can be fine. I'm talking about 40-1 and 50-1 and 80-1. Those horses have won a handful of times in recent years, and you just hit one of those, and man, it'll pay for a lot of losing tickets. The most recent of them was just a few years ago in 2022. A horse, Rich Strike, won at odds of 80-1. Wow. There are a bunch of things that make that the case, that make the Derby a great race to bet on really long shots. And the single thing, though, that drives it all is it's just a very chaotic, random race. None of these horses, being young 3-year-olds, the Derby's only for 3-year-old horses, none of them has ever raced this far in their career. They've raced a mile and a 16, so on and so forth. So you don't exactly know which of them are going to really relish that distance. That's one thing. The other thing is the crowd. 150,000 people there on hand. This is unlike anything these horses have ever experienced before. They're used to like 7,000 people showing up for a race and things being sort of subdued, and horses being, flight animals, skittish by nature. A lot of them are really set off by the crowd and lose their minds before the race is even
I didn't know that.
run.
So even horses who are used to racing can get freaked out by the louder, larger crowd.
Like 100%. Happens all the time. Happens all the time. And the last thing, and perhaps the most important of those chaos factors, is the size of the field. There are 20 horses in the Kentucky Derby race. On a typical race, on that typical sleepy Thursday in July, where there's 7,000 people and not 150,000 people on hand, there aren't 20 horses in the starting gate. There are 7, 8. They actually, at Churchill Downs, they have a special 20-horse starting gate that they only bring out once a year for the Kentucky Derby to get all 20 horses in. And when you have 20 horses on the track at the same time in a cavalry charge stampede, it creates all sorts of traffic pileups and collisions and suicidal speed duels between two horses. Like, all sorts of weird things happen. You have had year after year terrific horses that have done great things before the Derby and great things after the Derby flop terribly in the Derby just because all this weird stuff happens. And so as a result, you can get these really random results like that one 80-1 a few years ago.
So if I wanted to place my bet, I don't have to be at Churchill Downs anymore.
No.
Talk to us how the rise of online betting and gambling has changed the Derby and how people wager on it.
Well, all these racetracks, Churchill Downs included, has their betting app.
Have they had it for a while?
Yeah,
Okay.
Twin Spires. So Churchill Downs got Twin Spires. The New York tracks have Naira Bets, my betting app of choice. And there are a whole bunch of others out there. FanDuel, the sports books now are trying to get in a little bit. And I think they're having some success. We ran the numbers on betting on uber long shots in the Derby this century. It's produced a positive ROI, a positive return of 50% this century.
That's pretty good.
It is.
All right, so what are you going to do? Who are you backing? Are you going to bet? Are you going to bet a long shot?
Am I going to bet? Of course, I'm a gambler. Yes, I'm going to bet.
You got Renegade is an early favorite, 4-1 odds, but there's quite a few 50-1 horses. Are you going to do both?
So a few of the long shots for sure, and actually, truth be told, being the true degenerate I am, I've already locked some of those long shots, locked in bets in the futures market.
Because the odds can change.
The odds do change.
They do change. Okay.
And at the track, it's a funny system for a lot of people. Like when you bet a horse at 15-1 with 12 minutes to go before the race, you don't necessarily get 15-1. You get the final price that the horse goes off at.
Oh, okay.
But so for sure, some of the long shots, and then some of the more likely horses. I like the Puma.
Good name. It's a good name.
Is a good name. Good horse, more importantly. Emerging Market.
There's a horse named Emerging Market.
Yeah, so he's owned by...
You work at Bloomberg. You have to bet on the horse in Emerging Market.
I actually started my career in emerging markets, so yes. Actually owned by a hedge fund guy out of Boston. So a horse out of Japan called Dan & Bourbon. Now, the Japanese have been trying to win their first Derby for many years now, and Dan & Bourbon, there's a lot of buzz around him that he might be the one. Chief Wallaby is the last of the four I'll give you.
Gotta love a horse name. All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. But if you win on one of those 51 odds, you're gonna come back tomorrow and tell us all about it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Deal.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
The great David Papadopoulos.
You missed that and you missed
here in the
out.
halls
Yeah,
of
that was
Bloomberg.
fun.
I'm just looking at the latest odds here. Renegade 5-1, Intrepido 55-1, and your favorite, Emerging Market 11-1.
All right. I
You
mean,
gonna engage in this?
I think I missed my window,
You
but I
missed your
should have.
window.
I would have
All
put
right.
money on emerging markets in general and the horse.
Enjoyed that immensely. Again, Kentucky Derby, 152nd running of it taking place
Crazy.
this weekend. Get your mint juleps ready. We're coming up at 9 a.m. in New York. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now. Coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, breaking news. Spirit Airlines is going out of business and all flights are canceled after an attempt at a government bailout falls apart.
Hearing that Spirit is shutting down, I think it's insane.
What it means for travelers, employees, and the airline industry. Plus,
Iran offers a response to a draft peace proposal.
I am not happy.
After meeting with CENTCOM, will the president escalate to push for a better deal?
and gas prices up more than 35 cents from this time last week, as some of the world's largest oil producers get ready to meet tomorrow. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters here in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We are here with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, May 2nd, and we're going to go straight to Lisa for the headlines.
You got it. And many travelers, they say they're going to miss those affordable flights. We're talking about Spirit Airlines now, especially when the price of everything, groceries, gas, all seems to be going up. Now, this Spirit traveler was heading to Houston before the shutdown.
Usually we fly Spirit all the time. Usually it's the best affordable flight. And it's kind of like that reliable car that you have. It always gets you from point A to point B safely.
All Spirit flights have been canceled. Passengers, well, they've been advised not to go to the airport. That's after the discount carrier suffered under rising jet fuel prices, failed to secure a deal with the Trump administration for funding. Now, in a statement, Spirit CEO Dave Davis, he said that sustaining the business required hundreds of millions of additional dollars of liquidity that Spirit simply does not have. Now, several carriers, they've agreed to cap prices or reduce fares for customers that have been affected by the shutdown. To the war in Iran, where President Donald Trump said he's not happy with negotiations. During a West Palm Beach dinner event last night, he said enough is enough.
For 47 years, Iran has been pushing everybody around. They're the bully of the Middle East. They've been scaring everybody, Israel and Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, all of them. They're all, who's the bully of the Middle East?
The president stopped short of threatening to end the ceasefire between the countries and order some fresh airstrikes. Energy prices, they have soared because of the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran insists that the U.S. must end a naval blockade in its ports before Tehran's leaders were willing to reopen the waterway. Now, oil prices did ease on Friday, though, after touching wartime highs this week. Meanwhile, the Pentagon ordered the withdrawal of about 5,000 troops from Germany. It comes days after German Chancellor Friedrich Merz questioned President Trump's handling of the war in Iran, saying that the administration was being, quote, humiliated. Now, the drawdown, it's going to take place over the next 6 to 12 months. And Berkshire Hathaway came out with his first quarter earnings as Greg Abel gets ready for his first annual meeting as CEO. The big headline from that, its cash pile hit a record $397 billion. Another note, operating earnings, they total about $11.35 billion. That's up about 18% from a year earlier. And underwriting earnings from its collection of insurance businesses, they surged to $1.7 billion. That's up about 29% from a year ago. David and Christina, that meeting just moments away.
Just getting ready to start, and if history is prologue here, they can last a very long time. Warren Buffett would take questions for hours and hours alongside Charlie Munger. We'll see if Greg Abel does the same thing.
To see what the endurance is.
See
The
what
first
the
one out
endurance is.
might be a little exhausted.
We'll keep an eye on that as
Thanks,
well.
Lisa. As we talk constantly, it seems, about the affordability crisis here in this country, everything's getting more expensive, including travel. And this morning, our top story, another one hits the dust. Spirit Airlines has ceased operation and grounded its fleet following a collapse of that final federal bailout proposal.
This morning, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy taking to social media stating the Department of Transportation is working with major U.S. carriers, including United, Delta, JetBlue, and Southwest, to cap ticket prices for stranded Spirit Airlines passengers, while others offer reduced fares and employee support following service disruptions. Joining us now, Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent, back with us on set, along with the Points Guy managing editor Clint Henderson and Patrick Haan, head of petroleum analysis for GasBuddy. As Lisa mentioned just a moment ago, this is a fuel story, very much a fuel story. So we'll get into both how that's affecting air travel and cars and trucks as well. Jeff Mason, let me start with you and just get your perspective on how this fell apart. We heard the president yesterday as he made his way from the White House to Florida, indicating that this deal wasn't dead. He was waiting to see, I guess, what was on the table. And then around 3 o'clock this morning, we heard from Spirit that they were, in fact, closing their doors. What happened between when he was walking outside the White House in the Rose Garden to when we got that announcement early in the morning today?
Well, I think it sounds like it just didn't turn out to be a good enough deal for the government. And the president, as we've talked about before, likes to describe himself as a deal maker. He wrote a book about being a deal maker. It's something that's actually hanging over the Iran war right now as well. He wants a good deal, and it just wasn't a good enough deal for him, which is actually sort of understandable because running an airline is not easy, and not just running the airline, but the financials of this particular airline were obviously so poor that it's now gone out of business. And it just didn't turn out to be what they wanted from the federal side.
We were talking about the constraints of trying to run a budget airline in this country versus Europe. Negotiations with really only one pilots union drives up costs. And of course, fuel is the big cost, and it's hard to do when you're trying to keep those prices low. Speaking of, Clint, I want to ask you, if you are a consumer and you liked this budget airline option, where are you going to notice this the most? Which routes are going to take a hit? And how many passengers? Do you have any idea how many people are currently stranded or without flights?
We don't know the exact number of stranded passengers, but I will say all the major airlines have stepped up to offer these rescue fares. So that's really encouraging to see. I know American, Delta, United, everyone's offering to help out stranded passengers here. As far as it goes with pricing in any market that Spirit was operating, you're going to see fares jump almost immediately. We saw Spirit pull out of Minneapolis not too long ago, and Delta raised fares almost immediately by a substantial margin. So that's why, we all love to hate Spirit, but you're really going to hate it when they leave markets like Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, places where they drive costs down. You're going to see prices really spike.
Yeah, earlier I was referring to it as the Waffle House of the air.
Oh,
and to be clear, I like Waffle House. I'm a big Waffle
yeah.
House fan. Sometimes it hits the spot. And with Spirit, sometimes you just needed to get there. And now that's one less option, I guess.
Clint, I was asking Jeff about the kind of political nature of all of this, how the president was looking at this prospective deal. Take us behind the scenes at this company. This is an airline that had gone through 2 Chapter 11 filings in the last year. I guess was retaining some optimism here that it could make it through this latest stretch. How much of this, its decision to close down, is attributable to just general problems within the company, or is it attributable to just the fact that fuel prices have gone up as much as they have recently?
Look, the cost of jet fuel was the nail in the coffin, but the truth is Spirit has not really been a profitable company for half of a decade now. So my fear is that this is not just a Spirit problem. This is a low-cost carrier model problem. So, a bailout of the other low-cost carriers or even the mainline carriers could be coming if the cost of jet fuel remains as high as it is. I'm particularly worried about airlines like JetBlue. The truth is, it's very hard to remain profitable with the cost of jet fuel as high as it is. But my fear is we end up with just the mainline carriers left, Alaska and Hawaiian, Southwest, American, Delta, United, and that means higher fares for all of us. Already, we've seen fares jump between 10 and 30% for summer travel. So fasten your seatbelts on that front.
Talk about the politics of that.
Sure.
The president has been wanting to have a tour around the country. This is something that we talked about before, to talk about his economy, to talk about his success.
And he can't afford the fuel. I'm just joking.
Yeah, he probably can. He probably can.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt.
Not at all. The irony of him wanting to talk about his record in the months before the midterms is it's his actions that are leading to this going up, leading to the fuel prices going up. Leading to inflation, the inflationary impact of the war, of the oil prices, of gasoline prices. It makes a tough political sell when you're trying to hold on to control of Congress.
So, Patrick, on that note, gas prices we saw in California were really high this week. Planes, trains, automobiles, maybe not trains, but definitely cruise ships. If you are trying to get around, if you're trying to have any kind of vacation, seems like all of these options are not great. And just when it comes to affordability, where are Americans really going to start to feel these high gas prices the most?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, West Coast areas, you're already seeing prices over $6 a gallon in California. So the West Coast may not be the place to travel this summer. And the nation's interior, whether it's the plains, the Rockies, not so much the Great Lakes right now due to some refinery issues, but the nation's interior is going to be a little bit more insulated from those higher prices this year. And that's just because that fuel that is produced in those areas, the plains and Rockies, can't as easily be exported as what's produced in, say, the Gulf Coast or the East Coast or the West Coast, where we're seeing a lot of pressure now from overseas markets, from diesel to jet fuel to gasoline being exported. In fact, in the last week alone, the EIA reports that nearly 100 million barrels of oil and refined products have left U.S. shores. And that's going to put an immense amount of pressure, especially on the West Coast, where California now, with the loss of 2 refineries in the last 8 months, that's far more critical. California now left to import fuel. And keep in mind, the interesting part of this is some airlines, you mentioned Spirit, North Atlantic, saying we're done with California because of the risk of a jet fuel issue on the West Coast. It's certainly elevated. It's certainly not what it might be in areas like Europe. But you talk about jet fuel, the price has doubled. Some airlines saying we're not going to gamble on the West Coast. And look at all the airlines pulling back from some of their routes, looking at more efficient, boosting capacity. I mean, when a Boeing 787-9 costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars to fill, you're talking about over $500 on an average seat map for those 300 seats. It's incredibly expensive right now to fly these airlines overseas. The long hauls will probably stick, but across the board, from gasoline to jet fuel to diesel, consumers are going to be feeling it left and right this summer.
Patrick, gaze into the GasBuddy glass ball. Give us your clairvoyant take here of what this looks like in the summertime. We hear from Kevin Hassett, the president's closest economic advisor, that these prices could go down as quickly as they've come up. It's something for the president to say as well. This is a blip, I think he's said about the surge that we've seen in fuel prices. Patrick, what's it going to take? Say we had a cessation of fighting that was lasting, permanent in the Middle East. How soon would prices recover if, in fact, they do?
Well, you talk about prices going back to their pre-war level. I think that's next to impossible to happen, probably for the good majority of the rest of this year, unless the pendulum were to swing wildly open very quickly. I mean, everything would have to be going backwards for us to get to that point where that's possible, right? We're not seeing any agreement between the U.S. and Iran. We're far apart on that. The Strait was open until it was closed. So even if there is some clarity, it's going to take a little bit of verification and time to build confidence. I don't think we're going to see any real case of gas prices this summer falling below $4. Maybe if the Strait reopens, we could see the national average falling to the mid to upper $3 range. But even then, those prices are still 75 cents to $1 a gallon more than what we were seeing over the winter. So Americans are going to have to buckle up. I think we're going to start Memorial Day, starting the summer driving season, with prices over $4. And if the president doesn't act on reopening the Strait and coming up with some solution, that gas prices this summer could even hit $5 a gallon. Heck, they're already $5 a gallon on the West Coast. In the Great Lakes, they're pushing $5 a gallon. That may become more of a reality for much more of the country if the Strait doesn't soon reopen.
Patrick, I know we want to get back to airplanes here, but you mentioned those gas prices, price we're paying at the pump. I know that there's been some speculation the president might, through executive action, try to remove that gas tax. Would that make a notional difference for those of us who have cars and drive around?
Well, first of all, that would require an act of Congress to waive that federal gas tax of 18.4 cents. Let me color it this way, that Georgia and Indiana both have gas tax holidays right now, but you look at what happened in the Great Lakes, and Indiana now is paying the exact same as Michigan and Ohio when it comes to gasoline. Those due to some refining issues. States have tried this. In fact, I think Texas is now talking about it. Other states are looking at this. The Canadian government, for their part, has also eased a 10 cent a liter in Canada excise tax. So it would work, but it will require Congress, and that's anything but guaranteed right now. It would be temporary. I mean, 18 cents when the national average is $4.45 a gallon is kind of like rubbing salt in the wound. But back to the airlines, by the way, earlier this week, you talk about trying to run an airline in this type of environment. Jet fuel in Chicago briefly spiked well over $5 a gallon just this week. And you're seeing a lot of these hotspots from coast to coast, inland and areas of the coastal region. Jet fuel's just all over the map. You fly into Dallas and jet fuel's $3.80. You fly into Chicago and it's over $5 a gallon. It's got to be a nightmare for airlines to sort this out.
Jeff, talk to us about the messaging from the White House, because the president last night was essentially saying oil is high, but it could be much higher. It could have been much higher. It's actually not as high as we expected it to be. Is that going to work if we're rolling into midterms and these prices are still where they are? Because as we've been talking about ad nauseum, insurance is what the shipping industry kind of runs on. And even if the Strait were to open tomorrow, the threshold not only to pay these sailors and captains to be willing to take that risk, but just the risk factor is going to make insurance costs go up, which is going to make shipping. We're not going to get back to that floor anytime soon.
Well, and what the quote that you just cited is vintage Donald Trump. I mean, to say, oh, I thought it was going to be higher, this isn't that bad, and also to predict that they're going to come down just like that, he doesn't know that. And the political reality is you're talking about $5 gas. Good grief. I mean, being over $4 a gallon is already painful. But if consumers are going into the voting booths in November having paid $5 a gallon for gas, or perhaps still paying that much, it's going to be very painful for Republicans.
Clint Henderson with the Points Guy. Let me ask you about what you're looking for from the administration going forward here. So we have Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy kind of tweeting through this. A lot of posts on social media this morning about what should happen, noting the fact that there are going to be these lower fares for passengers who are stranded. What is, as you see it, the role of the federal government here as an airline goes under and passengers are picking up the pieces?
Yeah, well, it's really unusual in the United States to see an airline liquidate like this. I'm really glad the government stepped in to try to encourage other airlines to take care of these passengers, because we really just haven't seen anything like this since 2006, 2008. I expect more consolidation. As far as what the government can do, I'd love to see them reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That's going to be the big answer to a lot of these issues. But right now at the Points Guy, we're telling people, go ahead and book all your flights for the rest of the year. If you can afford it, lock in prices now, because I do think we're just going up from here. I'm booked through spring of next year just because I want to get ahead of it, because it's not just price of tickets, it's fuel surcharges being added and rising bag fees. The airlines are going to try to recoup this as best they can, and the consumers are going to pay for it. And remember, because the airlines are also reducing capacity, unless we see a drop in demand, there's more passengers trying to get fewer seats, and that also leads to price increases.
Clint's got spring break already planned,
Clint,
Christina.
I'm amazed by that. I aspire to have the kind of life where I can plan trips out 2 years in advance. These guys give me a hard time.
I don't want to pay more than I have to. That's why.
I haven't even planned this summer. Jeff, we've only got about 30 seconds. But Clint would like the government to reopen the Strait. How's that going?
I mean, the president said this week that he's unhappy with the deal or the most recent proposal from Iran. That doesn't suggest that there's going to be any agreement anytime soon, and there's going to have to be an agreement before the Strait is opened again.
And Iran's semi-official news agency saying something similarly bleak this morning. All right.
Thanks to all of you.
We'll
Jeff
leave it there.
Mason, our White House correspondent here on set with us in New York, Clint Henderson with the Points Guy, Patrick Haan of GasBuddy, giving us an update on those fuel prices, which of course were a huge factor in Spirit's decision, so much as it was Spirit's decision to close down. News that we got this morning at about 3 o'clock Wall Street time. Well, we were expecting to hear from Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy a bit later this morning. When he does start speaking, we'll bring you the latest headlines, his comments as soon as they happen.
And as we just said, Spirit is blaming the downfall on jet fuel prices. What's happening in the Strait of Hormuz? Well, we're going to talk with Bloomberg Opinion's Javier Blas. That's straight ahead. On Bloomberg this weekend, he breaks it all down and talks about whether it's a big problem or whether it's workable in Iran and other places trying to store all that oil with nowhere to go. We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And America's biggest oil companies, they're warning that global crude markets may be nearing an inflection point of higher prices the longer the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. Now, on an earnings call, ExxonMobil CEO Darren Wood said the market hasn't seen the full impact.
The ships got to reposition themselves. We got to work through the backlog. Then there's obviously the transit time to get the product to market. And so we're thinking there's going to be a 1 to 2 month time lag between the Strait opening up and the market seeing normal flow.
In other news, a federal appeals court has granted Louisiana's request to temporarily pause the mailing of abortion pills. FDA decisions had allowed mifepristone to be mailed into the state despite its abortion ban. Now, reproductive rights groups, they say the pill is proven to be safe. It now moves to the Supreme Court. May Day protests, they centered on labor rights and economic justice. They were held nationwide yesterday. Multiple demonstrations, they were held right here across the city in New York. Mayor Mondami was there showing his support. And in company news, Apple has raised the starting price of its Mac Mini desktop by removing that entry-level model. Now, the computer now starts at $799. The company is adjusting to inventory shortages that was driven by that high AI demand and also that tight supply of processors. The discontinuation of the $599 tier comes after that model had actually sold out at most outlets. People couldn't get their hands on them.
No, and now that laptop, incredibly popular, that inexpensive laptop. I remember that well because it was a pointed question that I got wrong.
Yes.
But I don't mean to
I didn't want to say it,
dredge that
okay.
out once again, but
Lisa, I'm not feeling good about today's
I'm
quiz.
like an elephant. I never forget.
This might be another
tuned.
David Gura win, but we'll see. All right. Thank you so much, Lisa.
We're paying attention still. I just want to note this. There's supposed to be a news conference taking place at Newark Airport here just outside New York City with the Transportation Secretary. We've been talking about Spirit Airlines closing down, the Transportation Secretary tweeting about what recourse passengers have. We expect to hear from him soon, so we'll be monitoring that and bringing us comments as soon as they happen.
That's right. We're going to keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, the two biggest U.S. oil companies reported earnings Friday for the first time since the Iran war began. Exxon and Chevron beat expectations, with oil and gas prices rising since February, which offset drop in supply.
We spoke with our colleague Javier Blas, columnist for energy and commodities here at Bloomberg Opinion, about the ongoing threat to global energy supplies. Take a listen.
It's not just the price of oil and natural gas outside North America that have gone up. Also, refining margins have been incredibly high through the month of March, and both Exxon and Chevron indicated that they ran the refineries very hard through that period. So I think that is one of the key reasons that the results have been as good and surprising to the upside to Wall Street.
We've been hearing from the administration. President Trump met with the head of CENTCOM, and it seems like they want to stick with this blockade. I have two questions for you. How much pain is this actually inflicting on Iran? And talk to us about the storage issue. The administration says Iran is running out of storage. Is that real or not?
Well, starting from the first part of your question, it's inflicting quite a lot of pain because Iran effectively is losing around $175 million a day in lost income from the oil revenue, from the oil exports. But the key question is that enough for Iran to come to the negotiation table with an offer that is good enough for President Trump? And the answer potentially is not enough. Iran made quite a lot of money for the first 2 months of the war, where it was able, and the U.S. have no problem letting Iran selling his oil. So in some way, they have some money that they cash in the early days and weeks of the war, and they can use that extra money that they made to cushion the current blow. On the question of is there going to be any long-term damage to the oil wells, My view is no. First of all, Iran is still loading oil into tankers. It was on Friday, according to satellite pictures that we were reviewing at Bloomberg, loading a super tanker at Car Island. So that's an indication that Iran still has access to tankers that they were inside the Persian Gulf when the blockade started, and it has onshore storage. So I don't see Iran having to start reducing production at the earliest until probably the middle of May. And will that cause some damage? Probably not. And even if there was some damage, will be that really what is going to prompt the Iranian authorities to come to the table with an offer that President Trump is satisfied? Again, I don't think so.
In the midst of this ceasefire, how much production is Iran able to do? Just give us your vantage on the degree to which oil production in Iran continues apace.
Well, if we look at crude oil and condensates, Iran was producing around 3.5 million barrels a day, exporting about 1.8 million barrels a day. The rest goes to the domestic market. So Iran needs to produce somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 million barrels a day just to keep the country fuel. Perhaps the demand now in Iran is a bit lower than otherwise because of the destruction of the war, because people are not traveling, because mobility is down. But Iran is a big oil consumer on his own, so a significant chunk of his production goes into the domestic market, and then the rest of it goes to the export market. At the moment, Iran is loading steel tankers, but those tankers cannot really reach the high seas. They are stopped by the U.S. Navy. That's where we are today. At some point, they will run out of tankers. They will need to start storing the oil onshore into tanks, and at some point, they will have to reduce production, shut down the wells, shut in the wells, as we call it in the oil industry. That moment has yet to arrive.
You said Iran probably has to make those decisions starting at the end of May. What about other big producers in the region? Are there any other producers that you think are nearing or will near their storage capacity and start to throttle back potentially sooner rather than later?
Well, every other producer in the Persian Gulf have already maxed out their storage capacity. That's what production in places like Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar has completely collapsed. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates continue to produce oil. That's because they have bypass pipelines that they can bypass the Strait of Hormuz, reach the Gulf of Oman in the case of the UAE, or the Red Sea in the case of Saudi Arabia. That's the reason that they keep producing. But everyone else in the region have to take those decisions to shut in oil wells in the very early days of the war. And no one really at the White House is talking about the Kuwaiti oil fields exploding because they have to be shut down. I think that this focus on Iran having a particular problem is misplaced. Everyone in the region produce oil from a very similar carbonate reservoirs. Yes, perhaps the Iranian oil fields are older and have some low pressure and has been under sanctions, don't have American technology, but the Iranian petroleum engineers have been very creative over the last 40 plus years to keep those oil fields running despite everything.
You mentioned the UAE. UAE saying sayonara to OPEC Plus, which is meeting this weekend. So I imagine those members are going to lick their wounds and then try to plot a path forward here. What does that look like? How does OPEC Plus move on from the UAE going its own?
Well, on the short term, nothing changes because with OPEC, with the UAE leaving, but they cannot increase production because the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, and the UAE is already maxed out on the bypass pipeline that they are using. So short term, nothing changed. Medium term, if the Strait of Hormuz reopens, the UAE will start increasing production. There will be demand for those barrels because we are really running down the world's oil inventories, both on the commercial side and on strategic inventories. Everyone is going to have to buy extra oil to replenish those inventories. But we were wondering where that extra oil was coming. Now we have a bit of an answer. That extra oil probably is going to come from the UAE. Long term, that's a more difficult one. I think that the UAE keeps increasing production. I put Saudi Arabia on a corner. At some point, Saudi Arabia needs to decide, say, mid of 27, early 28, do we want to reduce production to keep prices higher, or we just join the United Arab Emirates. And that also, other members in that cartel are going to be thinking, are we taking the right decision, staying with the Saudis, or should we follow the UAE? And I think that we are going to see over the next few months other countries starting to talk quite openly about potentially leaving the cartel.
That was my question, is if you look at those OPEC members, especially the ones who do throttle production, I mean, some, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, Libya, Nigeria pretty much produce at capacity most of the time, but those who are really those big players have to be watching this very closely. And can Saudi hold this together? If you were going to pick the next potential defector out of OPEC, who would be your bet?
I will say two names, one on the OPEC Plus group, on the big alliance. I will be Kazakhstan. They are acting like they are out, but they are keeping inside because of the relationship with Russia and because probably they say, well, we're gonna produce as much as we can. We are cheating all the time. Better to cheat within the group and we get some of the information and some of the upside. We are free riding effectively the cartel, but can Kazakhstan at some point say goodbye? I think that as a candidate. The other one inside OPEC and one of the founding countries and one where the US has a lot more influence, Venezuela.
Yeah.
The government of Delcy Rodriguez says that they are staying, but at some point over the next 12, 18 months, I will hope that we will see democratic elections in Venezuela. If that election turns to opposition government, the opposition historically has been hostile to OPEC, and then we can see Venezuela leaving. And that will be a big deal because it's a country that wants to produce more oil, that is going to have probably the investment to produce more oil, and it was one of the founding countries of OPEC. That will be a big deal. That will be the first departure of one of the original founders.
Javier, last question for you. Iran is doing all of this right now, and there is talk, I know, of finding ways to reroute oil going forward in the future. How long is that likely to take? How real is it that there could be kind of a whole new infrastructure built here in the next years or decades to get oil out of this region?
Well, you don't have a lot of permitting fights in Saudi Arabia. Usually the Royal Palace decides to do a new pipeline, they just do it. The original east to west pipeline, that is the one that we are using at the moment to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, that's the one that runs from the Persian Gulf in the east of Saudi Arabia to the west coast into the Red Sea. That was built in the 80s in 4 years. And that's when they have to build the whole line, do all the earth movement, all the difficult job. So I will think that 4, 5 years max, we see a lot more pipelines. So we have this odd situation. We are at peak of the influence of Iran on the Strait of Hormuz. They have never had a grip on the Strait of Hormuz as they have. But just because they are having that grip today, that grip over time will be weakened because more countries in the region will build bypass pipelines. I'm sure that Saudi Arabia will increase the capacity of their east-west pipeline. I'm sure that the UAE is going to do the same. Key question is, does Kuwait build a pipeline? And if so, through where? Probably south to Saudi Arabia and then across to the Red Sea. Do other countries, Qatar, build his own pipeline, perhaps through Saudi Arabia? That's politically more complicated. What Iraq wants to do has options through Syria, has another option through north to Turkey. There's already a pipeline there. It will be a question of expanding. So the region's pipeline politics are going to get really interesting over the next few years.
And if you don't follow Javier on Twitter, as most of us do, please do. You'll learn a ton. All right. Our top story this morning, Spirit Airlines closing up shop overnight. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy is expected to speak about what's being done to help stranded flyers any second now at Newark Airport. We will have more on that and everything else when we come back. That's Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Spirit Airlines shutting down operations after the White House bailout. Well, it fell through. All flights have been canceled. Several carriers, they've agreed to cap prices or reduce fares for affected travelers. In a statement, you had CEO Dave Davis said that this is tremendously disappointing, not the outcome that any of us wanted. Now, Spirit's been struggling for years, but rising jet fuel prices that put even more pressure on the company. We're waiting right now. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy is expected to hold a press conference at Newark Airport for an update. We will break in and let you know exactly when that does happen. In other news, GameStop reportedly preparing a bid for eBay. Sources tell the Wall Street Journal the video game retailer has been rebuilding a position in eBay and may make an offer for the business this month. Now, GameStop CEO Ryan Cohen, he's looking to scale the company beyond video games and collectibles. In the NBA playoffs, the Boston Celtics, Philadelphia 76ers play Game 7 tonight. The winner, they will play the New York Knicks in the conference semifinals. The Knicks advance after beating down Atlanta Hawks on Thursday, 140-89. Yikes. The Timberwolves, Spurs, Lakers, and Thunder have also advanced to the semifinals. And yesterday's NHL playoff action, the Buffalo Sabres, they won their series against the Boston Bruins, and the Vegas Golden Knights advanced, beating the Utah Mammoth. The Flyers and Hurricanes will play Game 1 of the second round tonight. And we can't forget the Kentucky Derby. Yeah, it gets underway today at Churchill Downs, with the first of the races kicking off at 11 a.m. local time. The main event will take place just before 7 o'clock tonight. A horse named Renegade has the best odds going into race day. David and Christina.
Do you watch this?
I do not watch it.
Pick a pony.
But I've reported from
You have?
different things, and not this one,
Not
but
this
a
one.
horse race on
Others
Long
in the
Island.
triple-
It's
okay.
nothing similar, but you do the dress up,
You
and
have
you do
to.
the hats, and you do the whole.
You looked into
pomp
getting
and
a hat this
circumstance.
week. It was
I did.
prohibitively expensive, I
It was
believe.
very expensive. Around in this neighborhood, the only Derby-worthy hat I could find started at $1,200. So
It looks
that's-
like we're getting some footage here from Newark Airport. Sean Duffy, the Transportation Secretary, stepping up to the podium there at Newark on the heels of Spirit Airlines announcing that it's closing down. We expect comments from him about what passengers' recourse is in light of that. Let's take a listen to what the Transportation Secretary has to say.
Reported this morning at 3 a.m., Spirit Airlines ceased operations. So what that means is Spirit does not have airplanes in the air flying as of this morning. Also, their call centers are closed, and they don't have staff at ticket counters. So if you have a flight scheduled with Spirit Airlines, don't show up at the airport. There will be no one here to assist you. What Spirit Airlines is now going to do is go through an orderly liquidation process. We'll see how that develops over the course of the next several days. But for customers of Spirit, I want to give information on how you can navigate this situation that you now find yourself in. And President Trump, Administrator Bedford, and I have been working with the other airlines across the industry in anticipation that this morning may happen. And so if you're a customer, many of the airlines that are not Spirit are stepping up to provide you assistance. So United, Delta, JetBlue, and Southwest are capping their ticket prices for Spirit customers. It's going to vary between the airlines. You have to go to their websites to take advantage of these special offers. It is normally going to be about $200 for a one-way ticket. You'll minimally have to provide to the airlines that you're now going to book with your Spirit confirmation number and your proof of payment. I would recommend that if you have a ticket with Spirit, that you actually try to book with these airlines as soon as possible. These offers are not going to be open forever, and the airlines are going to have varying degrees of time frames at which you can take advantage of the opportunity. Again, go to the airlines' websites. For customers who are concerned about higher prices because of the announcement today from Spirit, American Airlines and Delta Airlines are offering across the board reduced fares on high-volume Spirit routes. Allegiant is stepping up. They've also committed to freezing fare prices on routes that they have shared with Spirit Airlines. And Frontier is offering a 50% off base fares across the network until May 10th. So again, this is the airline industry stepping up and trying to provide relief as Spirit is going to go through this liquidation. If you bought a ticket with Spirit Airlines, they have a reserve fund. You will be refunded to your original form of payment if you bought directly from Spirit. If you purchased from a third-party vendor, say a travel agent, you're going to have to reach out to that travel agent and request that they secure a refund for you. The president specifically has been very concerned, as well as I and Administrator Bedford, about the employees of Spirit. And we're concerned about could they be stranded in certain destinations. So most U.S. Carriers are extending travel pass benefits. So that's maybe a spare jump seat or spare seats for any Spirit employees who need to travel back to their homes. That's for pilots and flight attendants and other employees. They've also offered Spirit team members preferential employment interviews. So again, there's a demand for aviation workers. So even American and United have drafted or crafted microsites for Spirit employees to potentially jump the queue, and get preferential treatment in the application process for the many airlines that are now hiring, whether it's pilots, flight attendants, baggage workers, or even those who've worked in the call centers. You can go to the individual websites to see what's offered by each of the individual airlines. I'll take your questions in a second, but I think it's important to talk about why are we here today. There was a proposed merger between JetBlue and Spirit, and Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, along with the Biden DOJ, decided that they did not want that merger to take place. And at the time, the Biden and Buttigieg DOJ bragged and said, as they canceled the option for this merger, that this was a victory for U.S. travelers who deserve lower prices and better choices. Now, many at the time said this was a disaster. This merger should have been allowed. And this today would indicate this is not better for travelers. This is not better for pricing. This is not better for competition. Actually, it's worse. We had an airline go down because the markets were trying to allow two airlines to merge, make them stronger, and offer more competition for the American consumer. Also, Elizabeth Warren at the time chaired the blocking of the merger, saying that this was a Biden win for flyers. So again, I think it's important that we always look with a keen eye when airlines want to merge. We care about pricing for consumers. We care about competition. But if the markets are saying there needs to be a merger because there's health issues with one of the airlines or more than one airline, we have to take a look at it and make sure we make the right choices. And in this situation, history has judged the denial of the merger between JetBlue and Spirit through the Biden administration with, I think, a view that it was a massive mistake. So we have been engaged, again, with the airlines for the last several days as we saw the potential of this wind down happening. And again, I want to thank the airlines in America for stepping up. The biggest airlines, the low-cost carriers, taking care of employees, taking care of customers, making sure that prices remain affordable, but also those travelers who could be stranded can actually get home. With that, happy to take any of your questions. Yes.
The president said yesterday that a deal was possible, but only if it was a good deal. Obviously, that didn't happen yesterday and in the overnight hours. Can you talk about where the breakdown was? What was the sticking point and what was the tension point there?
Yes, so the question is about the president yesterday said there's a potential for a deal, but it had to be a good deal. There was a number of ideas being floated on how the government could step in and be helpful to Spirit Airlines. The president was like a dog on a bone, trying to figure out a way to keep Spirit afloat. He was concerned about the employees of Spirit. I was in the Oval many times hearing him talk about the employees and the customers. In the end, this was a creditor issue. Again, they have the final say of whether they want to do a deal with the government. But also from the government's perspective, we oftentimes don't have $500 million laying around in a spare account that we can put into a bailout of an airline. So there was creative thinking on how it could happen. Those two things never materialized. There was a significant effort by President Trump and the administration to make it happen. But in the end, a deal couldn't be reached. And so here we are today.
You also brought up the floated merger between JetBlue and Spirit Airlines. Spirit Airlines isn't the only budget airline that's dealing with some of the same issues, the rising fuel costs due to the war. Do you foresee a chance where we could be staring down the same type of shutdown with other airlines as this war continues to go on?
So the question is, and I know you don't have a microphone, Spirit's not the only one who's having financial issues right now. There could be more. I would just point this out. Once the merger was denied in 2024, Spirit filed for bankruptcy immediately after the denial. And then last August, Spirit again filed for bankruptcy. So Spirit was in dire straits long before the war with Iran. Multiple times they had filed for bankruptcy. Their model wasn't working. They couldn't get to fiscal health. So this was not the impetus. The war was not the impetus for Spirit. Now, you've heard that other airlines have talked about requesting a $2.5 billion bailout. I am in continual contact, and my team is in contact with all the CEOs of the airlines. I would say that at this point, I don't think it's necessary. They do have access to cash. If they want to come to the U.S. government, we would be a lender of last resort. If they can find dollars in the private markets, I think that's better for them. If there was a need across the low-cost carriers who had made this request, again, there's not $2.5 billion that sit around in Congress that the executive branch can fund a bailout for those airlines. That would have to be a conversation that does happen with Congress, and there would have to be a real need. And so sometimes what can happen is when there's a conversation about Spirit Airlines and a potential a bailout, if you will, what other airlines see as an opportunity. Is this an opportunity for us to get money as well to help our airline out? Not necessarily based on need, but based on opportunity, and I think that's what was happening when the low-cost carriers put out a request for $2.5 billion.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Is there a concern long-term about fares that are capped now in the kind of emergency situation of people getting where they need to be, but with the loss of Spirit and a low-cost option, potentially down the road, costs could rise for travelers?
Yeah, the question is there a concern about low-cost carriers and competition and pricing? And we keep our eye on fares and on competition. But I think this is a great example that, again, by keeping an airline that wasn't healthy from a merger, it doesn't make the industry stronger. It created problems in the aviation industry. I want a lot of airlines. I want a lot of healthy airlines. I want the more premium airlines, but I also want a healthy a group of low-cost carriers. And that's going to, I think, give the American people different options, different prices to travel across the country. And so do I think what Spirit announced today is going to impact that? I don't. Are there some financial issues with some of the low-cost carriers? Yes, but they have access to capital, and many of them are well-run businesses. And I think that because the industry has become so competitive, a lot of the larger carriers have stepped up with really good offers with maybe better service. And so we're going to see a shakeout that happens. But again, we want options for the American traveler. We want competition, which means better pricing for the American consumer. Yes?
This fund for the ticket holders to get their compensation fund, do we believe it's sufficient to make everyone whole?
Yeah, so the question is about the fund for ticket holders. That was held in reserve by Spirit Airlines. So if you bought a ticket and hadn't flown that ticket yet, the dollars that you used to buy the ticket, those are held in reserve by Spirit Airlines. And so that money is there, and so refunds will flow to the original form of payment for those who had booked a ticket. So yeah, we feel very comfortable that you will get a refund for the portion of the flight that you didn't fly. But again, you have an opportunity. Some are for 5 days, some are for a couple weeks. With other airlines who are going to offer you a special deal, special pricing. Because again, the problem is, if any of us go online and try to book a ticket for today or tomorrow, those prices are pretty high, right? You get better pricing the further out you book. Well, if you're a Spirit passenger, well, you have an airline that ceased operations, so you have to book a ticket in the next day or two. And so the other airlines are.
All right, you've been listening to Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy making statements after the precipitous collapse of Spirit Airline overnight. He told reporters that Spirit is beginning the liquidation process now, but most importantly, if you have a ticket for Spirit Airlines, do not show up at the airport. He said other airlines, including United, Delta, JetBlue, and Southwest, are capping ticket prices for Spirit customers. You can get a $200 one-way ticket, provided that you can prove that you had a fare on Spirit, because they're concerned about people being trapped, and that extends to employees, pilots, flight staff that could be stranded at other airports. Other airlines are offering travel pass benefits, jump seats to those crew to try to get them on the cruise. They're also offering expedited job applications at American and other airlines if they want to try to get on board there. The Secretary also talked about the deal breakdown. He said there were a number of points that were sticking points. He said the president was, quote, like a dog on a bone wanting to keep it afloat. But ultimately, it was up to Spirit. And he said, the U.S. government doesn't have $500 million hanging around in a spare account.
Something else he talked about was how we got to this point. And I want to go back to the statement that we got from the president and CEO of Spirit, in which he blamed this dissolution of the company in part on the rise in fuel prices. The transportation secretary really disputing that, going back to 2024 when a proposed merger with JetBlue fell apart. That happened in March of that year. He drew a line between that and that company's first filing for bankruptcy protection, Chapter 11, which took place in November of 2024. Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent, former aviation correspondent earlier in his career, back with us on set here. And let me ask you about the politics of this. Christina bringing up the fact that he said repeatedly there isn't just $500 million sitting around for them to bail out an airline like this. Low, it's happened in the past. We're also at a moment where a war is now costing $25+ billion.
They got some other expenses going on.
Yeah, I wonder how you are thinking through sort of his rationale for what happened here and also the way that the administration has tried to respond.
Well, I think it's very interesting that he's specifically citing this merger having been blocked during the Biden administration. If I had been standing there and able to ask a question, I would have asked him, did you invite JetBlue and Spirit Airlines to reapply at the beginning of the Trump administration? Because that's been over a year, almost a year and a half now. So it's interesting that he's wanting to put blame there, and also interesting politically that no doubt he's assuming that the president is watching that press conference and he needed to say the president wanted these jobs to be saved. And I'm not questioning that the president did want those jobs to be saved. But this is not a great thing politically for them. A, that the prices of these tickets are going to start going up, and B, that there are a bunch of job losses.
I thought it was also interesting he was asked about an overall bailout for other airlines, and he said the U.S. government should be a creditor of last resort, that they should go to the private sector to try to find that money. Is that a sea change from where we were a couple weeks ago with this?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that that's even a concern at all. And again, all of this is tied to the war and the increase in fuel prices. But politically, it's also sort of interesting for a Republican administration to be talking at all about bailing out an airline, let alone an entire sector, if it's in fact having the impact that it looks like it's having on the low-cost airline piece of the broader sector.
Really quickly here, we brought it up earlier in the show, this meeting on April the 21st with other CEOs of ultra-low-cost airlines meeting with the transportation secretary. What's your understanding of what came of that? What's the level of dialogue like between the transportation secretary and these other low-cost carriers?
I don't have a whole lot of insight into that, other than, again, the fact that their meeting shows a level of concern, both at the administration level and at the airline level, that this is going to be a broader problem.
He also said, surprisingly, very quickly, he's not worried that this will make prices go up. Are you worried it'll make prices go up?
I mean, when you take an airline out of the mix, then these agreements that he's citing with United and some of these other legacy carriers to help, those aren't going to last forever. So, of course, when you take competition out, that leads to higher prices.
Jeff Mason, thank you very much for joining us over the course of the morning as this story developed. Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent, with us here in New York. And just to summarize what the transportation secretary said, move quickly, apply for these other benefits from other airlines soon. They won't be around forever. Thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. We hope you'll join us tomorrow starting at 7 o'clock Wall Street time. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We are here, of course, with Lisa Mateo. For our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, Masters in Business is up next. And for our TV audience, Wall Street Week with David Weston starts right now. We'll see you tomorrow, 7 a.m., right back here.